There is something happening to your memories right now, and it is not what you think. They are not fading. They are not healing. They are not being rewritten by time. They are changing because you are tired. Not emotionally tired in the way people usually say it. Not the poetic kind of exhaustion that sounds noble or dramatic, but the quiet biological fatigue that settles into the nervous system when the day has taken too much from you. And for reasons most people never notice, that is the moment when old memories begin to lose their sharp edges. Think about it. There are memories that hurt when you are awake and alert. Memories that feel like pressure points touch them lightly and the pain flares instantly. Words you replay, faces you avoid, moments you swear you have already moved past. Yet somehow, they still know exactly where to cut. But then night arrives. You lie down. Your body sinks into stillness. Your breathing slows. Your muscles loosen their grip. And suddenly, those same memories do something strange. They come back softer, not pleasant, not happy, but no longer dangerous. The scene is still there. The people are still there. The loss is still real, but the pain feels distant, muted, as if the memory is no longer standing right in front of you, demanding a reaction. Most people assume this means they are finally getting over it. That time has done its job. That forgiveness has arrived quietly on its own. But that is not what is happening. Your brain is doing something very specific when you are tired. Something ancient. Something efficient. Something that has nothing to do with moral growth or emotional maturity. Your brain is lowering its guard. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt comfort in these quiet recordings, if you've ever stayed longer than you meant to, take a second now to like this, share it, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings. This channel exists for moments exactly like this. Moments when the world finally stops demanding clarity, and you are allowed to simply exist inside a thought without fixing it. Now, stay with me. During the day, your brain behaves like a vigilant security system. It monitors threats, evaluates meaning, assigns blame. It keeps memories active, not just as images, but as unfinished business. Daytime memory is not passive. It is armed. When you remember something painful while alert, the brain does not simply replay what happened. It reactivates the emotional network around it. The tension, the justification, the self-protection. This is why certain thoughts feel exhausting even when nothing is happening physically. Your brain is rehearsing defense, but fatigue changes the rules. As you grow tired, your nervous system begins to conserve energy, not because it wants peace, but because it cannot afford constant vigilance. Cognitive control weakens, emotional regulation loosens. The effort required to hold firm positions becomes too expensive. And this is where the shift begins. The brain stops interrogating memory. It stops asking who was wrong. It stops constructing arguments you'll never deliver. It stops bracing for impact that is no longer coming. The memory remains, but the resistance dissolves. This is not forgiveness, as people usually imagine it. There is no conscious decision, no inner speech that says, "I forgive you." No moral high ground. It is closer to surrender, but not the dramatic kind. It is the quiet surrender of a system that has run out of energy to fight. Neuroscience doesn't describe this as healing. It describes it as inhibition failure. When you are tired, the brain's top-down control weakens. The mechanisms responsible for suppression, judgment, and emotional amplification lose strength. What rises in their place is raw memory, unpolished, unframed, unarmed. This is why old pain feels different at night. It is not that the memory has softened. It is that the part of you that sharpened it has gone offline. There is a strange relief in this, even when the memory itself is sad, because pain requires effort, anger requires energy, resentment requires constant maintenance, and fatigue removes the fuel. Philosophers have circled this idea for centuries, long before neuroscience had words for it. They notice that forgiveness rarely comes from strength. It comes from exhaustion. When people are full of energy, they defend their wounds. They protect their stories. They cling to their right to be hurt. But when people are tired, truly tired, the will to keep wounds open disappears. Not because the wounds close, but because no one is standing guard anymore. At night, the self shrinks, not disappears, just recedes. The sharp, vigilant version of you that maintains boundaries and narratives loosens its grip. The need to define, categorize, and defend fades. And without that pressure, memories lose their role as weapons. They become scenes, moments, images passing through awareness without demanding action. This is why you can think of someone who once caused you deep pain and feel sadness without rage, longing without bitterness, acceptance without explanation. It isn't wisdom, it's fatigue, and there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, this may be one of the most merciful features of the human brain. If we were forced to maintain full emotional intensity at all times, we would burn out quickly. So the brain built an escape hatch. When energy runs low, it stops fighting ghosts. The memory doesn't vanish. It simply loses its teeth. You might notice this happening as a kind of emotional blur. The edges soften. The story becomes quieter. You remember, but you do not react. And reaction is where suffering lives. Pain does not come from memory alone. It comes from the reflex to push against it. At night, that reflex weakens. Your breathing slows. Your muscles let go. Your attention drifts. And memories freed from confrontation settle into something gentler. Not resolved, not healed, just allowed. This allowance is powerful, even though it feels passive. It is the first time the memory is experienced without resistance. And resistance is heavy. Think about how tiring it is to hold a position all day, to keep telling yourself what something meant, what it says about you, what it demands from you. Fatigue collapses those demands. The brain, conserving energy, chooses the simplest path: observation instead of judgment, presence instead of reaction. That is why nighttime memories feel quieter, not because they changed, but because you stopped fighting them. And as you rest there, noticing this shift, another question begins to form. If memories only hurt when we have the energy to resist them, what does that say about pain itself? Stay here with that thought. Let it rest with you. There is no need to answer it yet. Just notice how the memory feels now. As your body grows heavier, your thoughts slower, your defenses lower. This softness is not weakness. It is what happens when the brain finally decides it is safe to stop standing guard. Fatigue is often misunderstood as failure, a personal flaw, a lack of discipline. But in the nervous system, fatigue means something else entirely. It means the brain is changing its strategy. When you are rested, your mind behaves like a gatekeeper. It filters, blocks, evaluates. It decides what deserves attention and what must be kept out. This is useful during the day, when threats are real and consequences are immediate. But vigilance is expensive. Every act of control, every effort to suppress a thought, reframe a memory, maintain composure, costs energy. And the brain, like any system designed to survive, does not spend energy carelessly. So when fatigue sets in, the brain does not collapse. It conserves. What looks like weakness from the outside is actually a strategic withdrawal. The first thing to go is resistance. Not memory, not awareness. Resistance. During the day, painful memories are met with force. You correct them. You argue with them. You reinterpret them in ways that protect your identity. You may not notice this happening, but the effort is constant. A subtle tightening of attention. A readiness to defend. At night, that readiness fades. The neural circuits responsible for top-down control, those involved in suppression, reappraisal, and emotional regulation, begin to quiet. Not because the brain wants vulnerability, but because it can no longer afford sustained defense. And when defense drops, something surprising happens. Memories no longer meet opposition. They arrive without being challenged, without being reframed, without being pushed away. This is why they feel different. The memory itself hasn't changed. The context has. Imagine holding a heavy object all day. At first, you grip it tightly, adjusting your hands, stabilizing the weight. But as your muscles tire, you stop correcting its position. You simply let it rest where it is. The object hasn't become lighter. You have stopped fighting gravity. This is what fatigue does to memory. It removes the muscular tension of the mind. Without resistance, memories lose their sharpness, not because they are dulled, but because sharpness requires pressure. Edge requires force. Pain, in this sense, is not just something remembered. It is something actively maintained. Anger must be fueled. Resentment must be rehearsed. Self-justification must be reinforced. All of this takes energy. When that energy runs low, the brain makes a quiet choice. It stops escalating. You may notice this as a strange neutrality, a sense that the memory is present but no longer demanding. Still sad, perhaps. Still meaningful, but no longer urgent. Urgency is expensive. Fatigue strips urgency first. This is why late-night thoughts feel slower. Why arguments you replay endlessly during the day suddenly lose momentum. Why questions that felt unsolvable hours earlier no longer insist on answers. The brain is not solving anything. It is stepping back. And in that distance, intensity drops. This is often mistaken for clarity. People say they see things differently at night. But what they are really experiencing is reduced friction. With fewer internal forces colliding, fewer narratives clashing, memories move more smoothly through awareness. This can feel like peace, but it is not resolution. Nothing has been concluded. Nothing has been repaired. The system has simply stopped pushing. And in doing so, it reveals something important. Pain is amplified by resistance. The more the brain pushes against a memory, the more energy flows into it. The more vivid it becomes. The more emotionally charged it feels. Fatigue interrupts this loop. It breaks the cycle not by changing the memory, but by withdrawing the effort that kept it inflamed. This is why people often feel more forgiving at night, toward others and toward themselves. Not because they suddenly understand more, but because understanding is no longer being enforced. The brain, conserving energy, chooses the simplest posture. Observation. And observation, without judgment, feels gentler by default. This is not kindness. It is efficiency. Yet the effect is profound. When resistance drops, the memory no longer behaves like an enemy. It becomes information, a trace, a moment that happened. Still real, still part of you, but no longer something you must push away. And as this state settles, in this quiet lowering of defenses, another shift begins to take shape. Because when the brain stops resisting memory, it also stops asking something else. It stops asking who is at fault. And that question asked endlessly while we are awake has more influence over pain than we realize. Just notice that question fading now. Not answered. Just absent. And consider what it means for a memory to exist without needing someone to blame. During the day, your mind holds itself upright. It keeps a posture. Even when you are sitting still, even when nothing is happening, there is a quiet readiness inside you, a preparedness that does not announce itself, but never fully turns off. This readiness is what gives memories their edge. When you are alert, the brain does not simply allow thoughts to pass through. It positions itself against them. It braces. This is why certain memories feel sharp the moment they appear, not because they arrive violently, but because the system that receives them is already tense. Think about how a blade feels different depending on how you hold it. In a relaxed hand, it is an object. In a clenched fist, it becomes dangerous. Memory works the same way. During the day, your brain grips. It grips meaning. It grips narrative. It grips the idea that what happened must still matter now. This grip is not conscious. It is structural. Neuroscience often describes the waking brain as top-down. Control flows from higher-order regions, those responsible for planning, judgment, and self-monitoring downward, shaping how information is processed. But this description, while accurate, misses something essential. It misses tone. Daytime cognition has a tone of readiness, a tightness, a forward lean. The brain is oriented toward action, even when no action is required. This orientation turns memory into a tool. Memories are scanned for lessons, for warnings, for unresolved threats. They are not allowed to simply exist. They must prove their usefulness. And usefulness, when it comes to painful memories, often means danger. This is why remembering something difficult during the day can feel like reopening a wound. The brain does not ask, "What happened?" It asks, "What does this mean now?" And that question sharpens everything. At night, the posture changes. The brain does not fall asleep all at once. It unwinds. The muscles relax first. The breath deepens. The heart rate slows. But alongside these physical shifts, something quieter happens. The mind stops leaning forward. The readiness dissolves. The vigilant stance, the one that treats memory as something that must be managed, begins to loosen. This is not passivity. It is a change in orientation. The brain is no longer preparing for response. Without that preparation, memories lose their demand for action. They are no longer instructions, no longer warnings, no longer unfinished tasks. They become images, scenes, traces. This is why the same memory can feel unbearable at noon and strangely distant at midnight. Nothing about the memory has changed. What has changed is the angle from which it is held. When you are alert, the mind holds memory upright, like a blade pointed outward. When you are tired, the mind sets it down, and objects placed on the ground do not cut. You may notice this shift as a reduction in emotional volume. The memory is still there, but it no longer shouts. It no longer pulls your attention sharply toward it. Instead, it drifts. This drifting is often mistaken for forgetting. But forgetting is not what is happening. Forgetting removes content. This removes pressure. Pressure is what makes memory hurt. Pressure is created by the brain's insistence on relevance. During the day, the brain insists, "This still matters." At night, that insistence fades. The brain becomes economical. Energy is low. Priorities narrow. Only what is immediately necessary remains active. And memory, especially old memory, rarely qualifies as necessary. So the brain stops investing in it. This withdrawal of investment is what you feel as softness, not warmth, not comfort, just the absence of sharpness. It is important to understand that this is not a moral process. Nothing about this shift implies maturity or growth. You are not becoming wiser at night. You are becoming less defended. There is a difference. Wisdom involves integration. Defense involves control. Fatigue undermines control, not understanding, which is why nighttime clarity can feel profound but evaporate by morning. The insights you have at night are not conclusions. They are states. States that depend on lowered resistance. As soon as energy returns, resistance returns with it. The blade is picked up again. This is why people wake up confused by the calm they felt the night before, why forgiveness felt real, until daylight rearmed the mind. Nothing changed overnight. The grip returned. The posture reset. The blade was lifted. But while the posture is lowered, while fatigue holds the brain in this gentler orientation, something important becomes visible. You see that pain is not just in the memory. It is in how the memory is held. The brain, when alert, compresses memory into a point. It sharpens it by forcing it into relevance. When tired, The brain lets memories spread out, and spread out things do not pierce. They occupy space quietly. This spreading is subtle. You may notice that the memory feels further away, even if it is vivid, as if you are watching it from a distance rather than standing inside it. This distance is not dissociation. It is perspective created by fatigue. Without the energy to enforce immediacy, the brain allows memory to recede. It is no longer happening now. It is something that happened. This shift from now to then is critical. Much of emotional pain comes from the brain's inability to fully locate memories in the past. Traumatic or unresolved memories are treated as ongoing threats. They are tagged as current. Fatigue loosens that tag. The brain, conserving resources, stops updating the threat status of old events. And without that update, the memory is reclassified. Not safe, not resolved, just inactive. Inactive things do not demand reaction. They can be observed without urgency. This is why nighttime memories often feel strangely factual. Less emotional commentary, less inner dialogue, more simple recognition. That happened. Recognition without commentary is gentle by nature. It does not argue. It does not accuse. It does not try to protect you. It simply exists. You might notice that when a memory appears at night, it arrives without the usual cascade of thoughts. No immediate explanations. No self-blame or blame of others. Just the image, the moment. The mind does not chase it. Chasing requires energy. Instead, the memory floats. And floating things do not wound. This floating state can feel intimate, quiet, sometimes sad in a clean way, a sadness without resistance, a sadness that does not demand change. This is often mistaken for acceptance, but acceptance implies a decision. This is not a decision. It is a suspension. The brain has suspended its usual posture toward memory, and in that suspension, sharpness disappears. There is something deeply revealing about this. It suggests that much of what we experience as emotional intensity is not inherent to the memory itself. It is generated by the brain's stance toward it. The brain's posture creates the pain. Change the posture, and the pain changes. Not because the past has been altered, but because the present has softened. You might wonder why the brain ever chooses sharpness at all. Why not remain in this gentle state permanently? The answer is simple. Sharpness has a function. During the day, the brain needs memory to guide behavior, to warn, to motivate, to prevent repetition. Sharp memories are useful. They keep you safe. But usefulness and comfort are rarely the same thing. At night, safety demands less. You are not navigating the world. You are not making decisions. You are not exposed to immediate threats. So the brain can afford to lower its weapons. And when the weapons are lowered, memories stop bleeding. This does not mean the brain trusts the memory. It means the brain is not engaging with it. Disengagement feels like peace, but it is temporary. As you lie there, noticing this change, you might feel a subtle relief, not joy, not resolution, just the absence of pressure. And in that absence, another question begins to form, not as a thought, but as a sensation. If memories only hurt when the brain holds them tightly, what is it exactly that the brain is holding on to during the day? And why does it feel so necessary to keep that grip? Let that question stay open. Do not answer it. Just notice how the memory rests now. As your body grows heavier, your breathing steadier, your mind less inclined to lean forward. The blade is still there, but it is no longer raised. There is a common belief that memories hurt because of what they contain, that the pain lives inside the event itself, inside the words that were spoken, inside the moment that could not be undone. But if that were true, memory would hurt the same way every time it appeared. And it doesn't. The same memory can feel unbearable in the afternoon and strangely gentle at night. It can make your chest tighten while you're awake, then soften into something almost neutral when you are exhausted. This inconsistency reveals something important. Pain is not stored inside memory like poison in a container. Pain is generated at the moment of recall, and the timing of that recall matters more than we like to admit. Your brain does not retrieve memories in isolation. It retrieves them inside a context. The context of your energy, your alertness, your readiness to act. When you remember something during the day, you remember it from a position of engagement. Your brain is active, oriented outward, prepared to respond. In that state, memory is treated as information that could still be useful. Useful for what? For correction, for protection, for control. The brain assumes that if it is bringing a memory forward, it must still be relevant to the present moment. So it sharpens it. It enhances the emotional contrast. It highlights the parts that once mattered most. It brings the intensity forward, as if to say, pay attention, this is important. That sharpening is what hurts. But at night, relevance collapses. Not because the memory is no longer meaningful, but because the present moment no longer demands action. You are not deciding. You are not defending. You are not correcting your course. The brain senses this, and sensing it, the brain stops preparing memory for use. Instead of sharpening, it lets memory arrive in its raw form, not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as a record. This is why old memories often feel like photographs at night, still images, quiet scenes, moments suspended without commentary. The pain you associate with those memories does not vanish, but it is no longer being actively generated. This leads to a subtle but powerful realization. Memories do not hurt because they are bad. They hurt because they are remembered at the wrong time. Or more precisely, they hurt because they are remembered while the brain is still in a posture of readiness. During the day, readiness is unavoidable. Even when you are calm, your nervous system is alert. Your senses are tuned outward. Your brain is evaluating possibilities. In that state, memory is pulled into the present. It is treated as if it could happen again. But fatigue disrupts this illusion. When you are tired, the brain no longer has the energy to collapse time. It stops dragging the past into the now. The memory is allowed to remain where it belongs, in the past. This separation is fragile. It does not come from insight. It comes from exhaustion. The brain, conserving energy, simplifies, and one of the simplest things it can do is stop treating old events as current threats. You may notice this as a sense of distance. The memory feels farther away, not less clear, just less immediate, as if you are no longer standing inside it, but looking at it from the outside. This distance is what softens the pain. Because pain thrives on immediacy. The more a memory feels like it is happening now, the more intense the reaction. When immediacy fades, intensity follows. This is why certain memories seem to wait until night. They do not surface because you are finally ready to face them. They surface because the brain has lowered its guard. During the day, those memories are blocked, not out of wisdom, but out of necessity. They would interfere with function. They would slow you down. At night, function is no longer required, so the gate opens. But when it opens, the memories that come through do not arrive armed. They arrive stripped of urgency. You may notice that the narrative around the memory also changes. During the day, remembering often triggers interpretation. You analyze what it meant, what it says about you, what you should have done differently. At night, interpretation weakens. The memory appears without commentary. No verdict, no conclusion, just presence. This presence can feel intimate, sometimes even tender, not because the memory is kind, but because it is no longer being interrogated. Interrogation is exhausting. Fatigue ends the questioning, and in the absence of questioning, memory becomes quieter. This quietness is often mistaken for closure, But closure requires resolution. Nothing has been resolved. The brain has simply stopped demanding resolution. This is an important distinction. If you wake up the next morning and feel the pain return, it does not mean the night was a lie. It means the context changed. Energy returned. Readiness returned. The brain picked the memory up again and asked what it was for. And in doing so, sharpened it. Understanding this can be unsettling. It suggests that pain is not fixed, that it is conditional, that suffering depends not only on what happened, but on when and how the brain chooses to remember it. This does not make the pain less real, but it does make it more dynamic. It means that softness is not something you achieve. It is something that emerges when resistance drops. At night, resistance drops because it must. The brain cannot maintain vigilance indefinitely, so it relaxes its grip on time. And in that relaxed grip, memory loses its ability to wound. You might notice this happening now. A memory that once felt heavy may feel strangely neutral as you think of it in this moment. Still meaningful, still true, but no longer demanding a reaction. That is not because you have forgiven, not because you have understood. It is because the brain has stopped asking the memory to justify itself. And as the brain rests in this state where timing matters more than content, another subtle shift begins. Because once the memory is no longer sharp, once it is no longer urgent, another question quietly takes its place. Not what happened, but why the brain ever needed it to hurt at all. There is a habit the brain develops early in life. When something hurts, it tries to make sense of it, not gently, not patiently, but insistently. The brain assumes that pain must be useful, that if something hurt once, it should never be allowed to happen again. So it begins to work on the memory. It edits it, rearranges it, adds explanations, builds arguments around it. This is not reflection. It is construction. During the day, the brain rarely allows a memory to remain unfinished. It does not tolerate loose ends. If a memory appears, the brain immediately starts asking questions. Why did this happen? Who was responsible? What does this say about me? What should I have done differently? What must I never allow again? Each question tightens the memory. Each answer sharpens it. This is how memories become weapons. Not because the event itself was violent, but because the brain keeps forging it into something that can be used. Used to protect, used to warn, used to justify, used to stay alert. But this forging takes energy, a great deal of it. And fatigue interrupts the process in a very specific way. When you are tired, the brain loses the ability to keep refining the story. It stops polishing the narrative, stops strengthening the edges, stops correcting the details to fit a position. The memory remains unedited, and an unedited memory feels different. During the day, memory is rarely raw. It has been shaped to serve a purpose. It has been framed. At night, framing collapses. The brain no longer has the resources to maintain a coherent narrative around every painful event, so it lets the narrative fall apart. This is why nighttime memories often feel incomplete, not confusing, just unfinished. There is less commentary, less explanation. You remember the scene, but not the argument built around it. The argument was heavy. The scene alone is lighter. This is not because the scene is harmless. It is because the brain is no longer holding it tightly enough to make it dangerous. Think about how exhausting it is to keep telling the same story to yourself, to replay the same justification, the same self-defense, the same interpretation of what went wrong. Even when you are not consciously thinking about it, the brain keeps the structure intact, like scaffolding around a building long after construction is finished. Fatigue removes the scaffolding, not carefully, not deliberately. It simply lets it collapse. And when the scaffolding falls away, the memory stands alone, without explanation, without conclusion. This nakedness can feel strangely peaceful, not comforting, but quiet. The brain is no longer arguing with itself, and without argument, intensity drops. You may notice that when you are exhausted, memories lose their complexity. They become simpler, not simplified in meaning, but stripped of interpretation. You remember what happened, but you do not immediately assign it a role. It does not have to teach you anything. It does not have to prove anything. It is allowed to exist without purpose. Purpose is expensive. Fatigue removes unnecessary purposes first. This is why the brain, when tired, stops demanding that memory justify itself. It no longer asks what the memory is for, and without that question, the memory loses its urgency. Urgency is what gives pain its edge. When something feels urgent, the body reacts. Heart rate changes. Muscles tighten. Attention narrows. At night, urgency fades. Not because the situation has improved, but because the brain has deprioritized it. Deprioritization is not dismissal. The memory is still there, but it is no longer at the front of the line. This shift in priority changes everything. Pain requires attention. It needs the brain to keep returning to it. When attention weakens, pain weakens. Fatigue disrupts attention. It slows it, scatters it, makes it harder to maintain focus on any single narrative. This is often experienced as mental fog. But within that fog, something else happens. The brain stops obsessing. Obsession requires clarity, requires energy, requires a steady stream of attention. Fatigue breaks that stream, and broken streams do not carve deep channels. This is why the same memory can feel overwhelming when you are sharp and manageable when you are exhausted. The content has not changed. The brain's ability to sustain obsession has. This leads to a subtle but important effect. At night, memories stop being rehearsed. During the day, painful memories are rehearsed constantly, even when you are not aware of it. They are reinforced through repetition, through reinterpretation, through silent internal dialogue. At night, rehearsal ends. The brain is too tired to keep practicing the same lines. So the memory appears once, then drifts away. It does not loop. Loops are where pain multiplies. Fatigue breaks loops. You may notice that at night, thoughts feel less sticky. They appear, linger briefly, then dissolve. Even difficult thoughts. This transience reduces suffering. Pain intensifies when the brain refuses to let go. Fatigue loosens the grip. There is also something else happening here, something quieter. When the brain stops editing memory, it also stops protecting the self-image built around it. During the day, memory is often used to defend who you think you are, to prove you were right, that you were justified, that you were wronged. These defenses require constant upkeep. At night, the brain cannot maintain them, so the self-image softens. And when the self-image softens, memories lose their personal charge. They become less about you and more about something that happened. This shift from identity to experience is profoundly calming, not because it absolves anyone, but because it removes the need to defend. Defense is heavy. Fatigue lays it down. This is why nighttime memories can feel strangely impersonal, still emotional, but not accusing, still sad, but not self-defining. You are no longer inside the memory, fighting to preserve a version of yourself. You are simply aware of it. Awareness without defense is gentle, not pleasant, but tolerable. And tolerance is often the first sign that pain is no longer being actively generated. It is important to notice that none of this requires insight. You do not have to understand what happened. You do not have to forgive. You do not have to reframe the past. The brain does all of this automatically when energy is low. This is not healing. It is shutdown. But shutdown in this case feels like relief. Because what shuts down is not memory, but the machinery built around it. The interpretations, the arguments, the self-protection. These are the loudest parts of pain. When they go quiet, what remains is manageable. As you lie there, noticing this quieting, you may feel as though the memory has lost its authority. It no longer tells you who you are. It no longer demands a response. It is simply there. And in that simplicity, another realization begins to form. If pain depends so much on the brain's effort to shape and defend memory, what happens when the brain is no longer interested in shaping anything at all? What remains of the memory? When the mind is too tired to tell a story about it, just let that question stay open. You do not need to follow it. Notice instead how the memory rests now. Less constructed, less defended, less sharp. Not gone, just unfinished. And in that unfinished state, something else is slowly changing. There is a chemical silence that arrives with fatigue. It does not announce itself. It does not feel dramatic, but it changes the way the brain interprets everything that passes through it. When you are alert, your body is quietly saturated with signals of readiness. Stress hormones circulate at low but persistent levels. They keep the nervous system responsive. They keep perception sharp. This is useful when the world is unpredictable. But at night, the chemistry shifts. The signals that once said, "be ready," begin to fade. Not vanish, just lower in volume. And as they do, the brain's relationship with memory changes again. Stress chemistry does not just prepare the body for action. It colors experience. It amplifies emotional contrast. It heightens threat detection. It sharpens edges. When those signals are present, memories are more likely to be interpreted through a lens of danger. What hurt once is flagged as something that could hurt again. The brain does not distinguish cleanly between past and future when these systems are active. It simply prepares. But fatigue reduces this preparation. As energy drops, the brain begins to limit chemical expenditure. It dials down what it can. One of the first things to soften is the internal alarm. This does not mean you are safe. It means the brain has stopped checking. Checking is expensive. So the alarm quiets. And without the alarm, memories lose their urgency. This is why nighttime thoughts often feel less threatening, even when they are sad. The brain is no longer asking, "What should I do about this?" It is no longer preparing a response. Instead, it allows the memory to exist without escalation. This chemical quiet is subtle, but its effects are profound. Without heightened stress signals, the brain does not push emotional intensity to the foreground. It does not boost the contrast. It does not sharpen the outlines. The memory arrives flatter, still detailed, still real, but no longer vibrating with threat. This flattening is often experienced as gentleness, not happiness, not comfort, just the absence of alarm. You might notice that when you are exhausted, even deeply painful memories feel strangely calm. They do not hijack your body the way they sometimes do during the day. Your heart rate stays steady. Your breath remains slow. Your muscles do not brace automatically. This is not because the memory has been neutralized. It is because the brain has stopped preparing you to fight it. The absence of preparation feels like peace. But it is a peace that comes from disengagement, not resolution. This is important. The brain is not making peace with the memory. It is stepping away from it. And stepping away changes how everything feels. Philosophically, this is where many misunderstand forgiveness. They imagine forgiveness as an act of will, a decision made from strength. But what you experience at night is not willful. It is involuntary. You are not choosing to let go. You are losing the capacity to hold on. Holding on requires energy. Anger requires energy. Resentment requires energy. Even grief, when actively resisted, requires energy. Fatigue removes that energy. And when energy is gone, The emotional systems that depended on it soften. This is why forgiveness often arrives unexpectedly, late at night, after long days, when you are too tired to maintain your defenses. It does not feel triumphant. It feels quiet, sometimes even confusing. You may wonder why something that once felt unforgivable now feels distant. The answer is not moral. It is biological. The brain, depleted, has stopped reinforcing emotional charge. Without reinforcement, charge dissipates. The memory does not disappear, but the reaction fades. This fading is often temporary. By morning, chemistry shifts again. Hormones rise. Alertness returns. And with alertness, the old interpretations may come back. This does not mean the night was false. It means it was conditional. Pain is conditional. It depends on chemistry, posture, energy, and context. Understanding this does not remove pain, but it reveals something essential about it. Pain is not fixed in memory. It is generated in the present. At night, the present is quieter, and so pain quiets with it. You might notice now that thinking of the same memory feels different than it did earlier in the day. Less sharp, less demanding. This is not because you have changed your mind. It is because your brain has changed its state. State matters more than story. The brain in a calm chemical state does not push memory toward action. It allows memory to rest. And resting things do not hurt as much. This is one of the brain's most compassionate features, even though it was not designed to feel compassionate. It was designed to conserve energy. But conservation, in this case, feels like mercy. As you remain here, in this lowered state, there is something else worth noticing. When the alarm quiets, when the chemical edge softens, another kind of perception becomes possible. Memories no longer feel like threats. They begin to feel like experiences. And that shift from threat to experience changes not just how memories feel, but how you feel in relation to yourself. Let that settle. Do not analyze it. Just notice how your body remains calm, even as the memory passes through. And notice how the absence of alarm creates space. In that space, something else is beginning to form. Not an answer, not a conclusion, just a quieter way of being with what happened. Forgiveness is often described as a decision, a conscious act, a moral achievement, something you arrive at after reflection, growth, and effort. But this idea collapses the moment you pay attention to when forgiveness actually happens. It rarely comes in moments of strength. It rarely arrives when you feel clear, energized, and in control. Forgiveness appears late, quietly, when you are worn down, when the body is tired, when the mind no longer has the sharpness required to maintain a stance. This is not accidental. Forgiveness, as it is commonly experienced, is not an action. It is a state. And states emerge when conditions change, not when decisions are made. During the day, the brain operates inside a framework of resistance. It resists vulnerability, resists ambiguity, resists unresolved pain. This resistance is not psychological in origin. It is biological. The brain's primary task, while awake, is to maintain coherence and safety. It does this by drawing boundaries between self and other, between right and wrong, between past and present. Painful memories threaten these boundaries, so the brain responds by tightening them. This tightening gives rise to moral language: blame, fault, responsibility, justice. These concepts feel philosophical, but they are grounded in a very practical need: the need to locate pain somewhere outside the self, so the self can remain intact. As long as you have the energy to do this, you will. You will hold on to anger not because you enjoy it, but because anger keeps the boundary firm. Anger says, "I was wronged." Resentment says, "This matters." Blame says, "I am still guarding this." All of these require effort. They require the brain to stay engaged with the memory, to keep it alive as a reference point. But fatigue changes the internal landscape. When energy drops, the brain no longer has the capacity to maintain rigid boundaries. The effort required to keep the story intact becomes too high. And this is where forgiveness quietly appears, not as a choice, but as a collapse. The collapse of resistance. You do not decide to forgive. You stop being able to sustain the posture that made forgiveness impossible. This is why forgiveness often feels accidental. You notice one night that you are no longer angry in the same way, that the memory does not provoke the same reaction, that the emotional charge has thinned. There is no announcement, no internal speech, just a subtle absence, the absence of fight. This absence can be unsettling. People often mistrust it. They worry that if they let go, they are betraying themselves. That softness equals weakness. That forgiveness means forgetting or excusing. But what is happening is far more neutral. The brain is conserving energy, and in doing so, it releases the need to maintain moral tension. Philosophers have long observed that moral clarity requires strength. To hold a position, especially a painful one, demands vitality. When vitality fades, positions soften. Not because they were wrong, but because they are no longer sustainable. This is why exhaustion can feel strangely honest. Not because it reveals truth, but because it strips away effort. What remains is not virtue or insight. What remains is tolerance. And tolerance feels gentle. Tolerance does not argue. It does not justify. It does not condemn. It simply allows. At night, when fatigue lowers the brain's resistance, the self itself becomes less rigid. The sense of I that insists on being right, being protected, being intact, that sense grows thinner. Not gone, just less dense. And when the self thins, the boundary between self and other loosens. This loosening is crucial. Most pain persists because it is anchored to identity. What happened to me? What they did to me? What this says about me? These phrases depend on a strong, defended self. When the self relaxes, these phrases lose their grip. The memory no longer needs to be positioned against you or for you. It simply exists. This is why forgiveness at night does not feel heroic. It feels almost indifferent. You may still believe what happened was wrong. You may still feel sadness. But the need to keep that belief emotionally charged disappears. This disappearance can feel like relief, but it can also feel like loss. Loss of certainty, loss of justification, loss of the sharpness that once defined the memory. Sharpness can feel like control. Letting go of it can feel like vulnerability. But vulnerability here is not exposure. It is the absence of effort. Effort is what keeps wounds open. Effort is what keeps stories alive. When effort fades, wounds do not close, but they stop bleeding. This is the form forgiveness often takes in real life. Not reconciliation, not absolution, just the end of active resistance. And this is why forgiveness feels easier when you are tired. Not because tiredness makes you kinder, but because it makes you incapable of sustaining hostility. Hostility is expensive. So is resentment. So is moral vigilance. Fatigue removes the budget. This does not mean the brain prefers forgiveness. It means forgiveness is cheaper, and the brain always chooses the cheaper option when resources are low. There is something quietly profound about this. It suggests that much of what we consider moral struggle is actually an energy management problem. We believe we are wrestling with right and wrong, but often we are simply exhausted. When energy is high, we can afford to maintain rigid distinctions. When energy is low, those distinctions blur. And in that blur, forgiveness appears not as a value, but as a side effect. This perspective can change how you view your own emotional patterns. If you notice that you are more forgiving at night, it does not mean you are inconsistent. It means your brain is operating under different constraints. During the day, You have the energy to protect yourself with sharpness. At night, you do not. Neither state is more true. They are different modes. One is defensive. One is economical. Both serve a purpose. The danger comes when we mistake the defensive mode for reality itself. When we believe that pain must always feel sharp in order to be real, but the night reveals something else. Pain can exist without sharpness. Memory can exist without accusation. Forgiveness can exist without effort. This does not solve anything. It does not fix the past, but it changes how the past lives in the present. As you lie here, in this lowered state, you may notice that the memory you have been carrying feels less personal, not erased, not invalidated, just less central. It does not define you in the same way. This decentering is not a loss of self. It is a temporary thinning of identity. And in that thinning, suffering eases. There is no lesson to learn here, no conclusion to draw, just an observation. Forgiveness is not something you do. It is something that happens. When the brain no longer has the strength to keep saying no, and as this realization settles, as the effort continues to drain, another subtle shift begins to occur. Because when the brain stops resisting memory and stops defending identity, it also stops doing something else. It stops trying to fix the past. And what remains, when fixing is no longer an option, is a different way of remembering entirely. There are memories that refuse to appear during the day, not because they are forgotten, but because they are actively kept away. They sit behind the noise of tasks, conversations, obligations. They wait behind movement. During daylight hours, the brain is selective about what it allows into awareness. It prioritizes what helps you function, what helps you move forward, what helps you stay intact. Some memories interfere with that. They slow you down. They soften you at the wrong time. They pull attention inward when it needs to face outward. So the brain does what it is designed to do. It blocks, not permanently, not cruelly, just enough to keep you moving. This blocking is not conscious. You do not decide not to remember. The nervous system decides for you. It keeps certain memories dormant while energy is required elsewhere. But at night, that requirement disappears. You are no longer navigating the world. You are no longer responding to demands. You are no longer expected to perform. And in the absence of demand, the gate loosens. This is why certain memories only appear when you lie down. Not dramatic ones, not necessarily traumatic ones, but personal ones, quiet moments, subtle losses, small disappointments that never had space to be felt. They rise not because they are suddenly important, but because nothing else is. The brain, no longer occupied with filtering, allows more material through, and what comes through first is often what was postponed. You might notice that these memories arrive gently, not as intrusions, not as flashbacks, but as images drifting into awareness. A face, a place, a tone of voice. They do not demand analysis. They simply appear. This is what it feels like when a memory is allowed rather than summoned. During the day, remembering is an act. At night, remembering is permission. This permission changes the quality of memory itself. The brain is not retrieving these moments to solve them. It is not preparing to act on them. It is simply letting them surface. And when memory surfaces without a task, it loses its sharpness. Sharpness requires direction. It requires the brain to aim the memory at something, a decision, a conclusion, a reaction. At night, there is nothing to aim at. So the memory floats. This floating can feel intimate. You may feel closer to the memory even as it hurts less, because intimacy does not require control. Control creates distance. Permission creates closeness. This is why some of the most emotionally honest moments happen at night. Not because the truth is clearer, but because resistance is lower. You are not guarding yourself as carefully. And without guards, memories move differently. You might notice that nighttime memories feel less linear. They do not unfold as stories with beginnings and endings. They arrive as fragments. A sensation, a look, a feeling without explanation. This fragmentation is important. Narrative gives memory power. Stories impose meaning. At night, narrative weakens. The brain does not have the energy to construct a coherent story around every memory, so it lets fragments exist as they are. Fragments are lighter than stories. They do not demand interpretation. They do not assign roles. They simply exist. This is why nighttime remembering often feels strangely honest. Not because it tells the whole story, but because it stops telling one at all. Without narrative, memory becomes sensory. It is felt rather than explained. And sensations, while sometimes sad, are rarely sharp. Sharpness lives in interpretation, the meaning you assign, the conclusions you draw, the identity you build around what happened. Fatigue strips away this meaning-making, not intentionally. It just cannot sustain it. So, the memory arrives closer to how it originally was experienced. Before it was turned into a lesson, before it was turned into a warning, before it was turned into a defining moment. Just a moment. This can feel vulnerable. Without interpretation, there is no shield, but there is also no blade. The memory is no longer aimed. It is simply present. You might notice that when these memories surface, your body remains calm. There is sadness, perhaps. There may be a heaviness, but there is no spike, no sudden tightening, no urge to push the memory away. This calmness is not emotional resolution. It is physiological permission. The nervous system is in a state where it allows inward experience without mobilizing defense. This state is rare during the day. The world demands too much, so the brain saves it for night. This is not generosity. It is efficiency. The brain uses nighttime to process what could not be processed earlier, not by solving it, but by allowing it to be felt without action. Feeling without action is profoundly different from feeling with intent. Intent turns feeling into pressure. Without intent, feeling softens. This is why you might think of someone at night and feel tenderness instead of resentment. Not because resentment is gone, but because tenderness does not require effort. Resentment must be maintained. Tenderness can exist passively. Fatigue favors passive states. It is easier to allow than to resist, easier to feel than to fight. This is why memories that felt impossible to touch during the day can be approached gently at night. You are not braver. You are not wiser. You are simply less defended. And defense is what made those memories inaccessible. There is a paradox here. We often believe that to face memory, we must be strong. But strength reinforces defense. Defense blocks access. It is weakness, specifically fatigue, that opens the door. Not because it is courageous, but because it cannot maintain the wall. This does not mean nighttime memories are more truthful. They are just less filtered. Truth does not require effort. Interpretation does. At night, interpretation fades. What remains is presence. This presence is quiet. It does not demand anything from you. It does not ask you to forgive. It does not ask you to understand. It does not ask you to move on. It simply asks to be noticed. And noticing, without obligation, is gentle. As you lie here, you may sense a memory hovering at the edge of awareness. Not pushing, not pulling, just there. You do not need to reach for it. If it comes closer, let it. If it drifts away, let it. This is how the brain processes without force. This is how memory becomes less dangerous. Not by being changed, but by being allowed to exist without a task. And as this permission continues, as memories move freely without being sharpened by purpose, another shift begins. Because once memory no longer needs to be avoided and no longer needs to be used, the brain begins to experience it in an entirely different way, not as something to react to, but as something to simply hold, lightly, without tightening around it. When the brain is awake and energized, it is always looking for a verdict, not consciously, not deliberately, but relentlessly. Every memory that surfaces during the day is quietly put on trial. Who was wrong? Who caused this? Who should have known better? What does this say about me? These questions run in the background. Even when you are not aware of them, they form the framework through which memory is experienced. And frameworks create tension. A memory placed inside a question is no longer neutral. It becomes a problem to be solved, a position to be defended, a wound that must justify itself. This is why daytime memories feel so sharp. They are not just memories. They are accusations waiting for answers. But fatigue dismantles the courtroom. When you are tired, the brain no longer has the energy to conduct a trial. Judgment is expensive. It requires attention, comparison, and constant evaluation. It requires the brain to keep multiple perspectives active at once. Who did what? What should have happened? What could have been different? This complexity collapses under fatigue. And when it does, the first thing to disappear is the question of fault. You may notice this subtly. A memory appears, but there is no immediate surge of blame. Not toward yourself, not toward anyone else. The event is remembered, but it is not assigned a culprit. This absence is not forgiveness. It is disengagement. The brain has stopped asking why and settled into that happened. This shift changes everything. Blame sharpens memory by attaching it to identity. When you assign fault, you tie the memory to who you are or who someone else is. The memory becomes personal, charged, active. Without blame, the memory loses its hook. It no longer grips the self. It becomes an occurrence rather than an indictment. This is why nighttime memories often feel strangely factual, not cold, not detached, just uncharged. You remember what happened without the immediate need to locate responsibility. And without responsibility, there is no argument. Arguments generate heat. Fatigue cools them. This cooling is often mistaken for emotional numbness, but it is not numbness. Numbness is absence of feeling. What happens at night is presence without escalation. You still feel sadness. You may still feel loss, but those feelings are not being amplified by judgment. Judgment is what turns feeling into suffering. Suffering requires a narrative. Someone did something wrong. Something should not have happened. Something must be accounted for. At night, that narrative loosens. The brain, conserving energy, simplifies its stance. It does not seek explanations. It does not demand justice. It does not rehearse arguments. It simply observes. Observation without judgment is naturally gentler, not because it is kind, but because it does not create friction. Friction is what makes memory hurt. Think about how exhausting it is to replay a memory, while simultaneously assigning blame. You hold the image in mind, while constructing reasons, defenses, and counter-arguments. Even when you are alone, the brain performs this work automatically. This is why thinking about certain things feels draining. You are not just remembering, you are prosecuting. At night, prosecution ends. Not because the case is closed, but because the court has adjourned. There is no one left to argue with. This absence of argument creates space, and in that space, memory behaves differently. It no longer feels like something that happened to you. It feels like something that happened. This distinction is subtle but profound. The moment you remove the idea of fault, the memory detaches from identity. It stops defining who you are, or who someone else must be. It becomes an event rather than a verdict. Events can be sad. They can be painful, but they do not accuse. Accusation is what keeps pain alive. This is why nighttime thoughts often feel cleaner, less cluttered. There are fewer mental voices, no internal debate, no rehearsed conversations, no imagined confrontations, just the memory itself. And the memory, on its own, is rarely as sharp as the story built around it. Stories give memory edges. They assign roles: victim, offender, mistake, failure. At night, these roles blur, not because they are false, but because maintaining them requires effort. Fatigue dissolves effort, and when effort dissolves, memory simplifies. This simplicity is not insight. It is absence of structure, but structure is what made the memory heavy. Without it, the memory feels lighter. Not easy, just lighter. You might notice that when blame fades, another sensation appears. A sense of distance. The memory feels farther away, not in time, but in ownership. It is no longer gripping you. You are no longer gripping it. There is a mutual release. This release does not mean you agree with what happened. It does not mean you excuse it. It means the brain is no longer trying to do anything with it, and doing nothing is restful. This is why nighttime remembering can feel almost meditative. Thoughts appear. They pass. No judgment follows. No correction. Just movement. Movement without resistance does not hurt. This is one of the brain's most overlooked capacities, the ability to let experience pass through without turning it into a problem. During the day, this capacity is suppressed. The world requires solutions. At night, solutions are unnecessary, so the brain allows experience to exist without purpose. This purposelessness is peaceful, not because life makes sense, but because sense-making has stopped. As you lie here, you may notice that the memory you have been carrying, it feels less like a question and more like a statement. It happened. No verdict attached. No demand. Just a fact, resting in awareness. This is what happens when the brain stops asking, who is at fault? Pain loses its sharpest edge, not because the pain is gone, but because the blade of judgment has been set down. And as that blade rests, another quiet transformation begins. Because once the brain stops judging the memory, it also stops reacting to it. And reaction, more than anything else, is what turns memory into suffering. Stay with that idea. Let the memory remain where it is, unjudged, unanswered. Notice how your body stays calm. And notice how, in the absence of fault, the memory feels less like something you must endure and more like something that can simply pass through. There is a moment, usually unnoticed, when memory splits. Not in content, in weight. The event remains whole. The images stay intact. The facts do not disappear, but the feeling attached to them loosens. This separation is subtle, and because it is subtle, most people miss it. They assume that memory is a single thing, that what happened and how it feels are inseparable. But the brain does not work that way. What you call a memory is actually two parallel processes moving together. One carries information, the other carries sensation. During the day, these two are tightly bound. When you remember, you feel. When you feel, you remember more. The loop is fast, reinforced, efficient. But fatigue slows the loop. And when the loop slows, the two processes begin to drift apart. You still remember what happened, but the emotional signal no longer arrives with the same force. This is not repression. It is decoupling. The brain, conserving energy, stops synchronizing every system at once. It allows memory to travel without dragging emotion behind it. This is why nighttime remembering can feel strangely neutral. Not empty, not numb, just getter. You might think of a moment that once carried intense emotion and notice that while the image is clear, the feeling feels distant, as if it belongs to someone else, as if it is no longer fully yours. This does not mean the emotion is gone. It means it has been unhooked. Emotion requires activation. Activation requires energy. Fatigue limits activation, so emotion lags behind memory. This lag is where softness emerges. During the day, memory and emotion arrive together, like two hands clapping. At night, one arrives without the other. And without that collision, the impact disappears. The memory does not strike. It passes. This is often mistaken for emotional maturity. People say they have processed something because it no longer hurts the same way. But what they are experiencing is often temporal, a state-dependent shift. The brain, too tired to fully engage emotional systems, allows memory to surface without igniting the same response. This can feel like healing, but healing implies permanence. This is conditional. The feeling may return when energy returns, but that does not make this moment meaningless. It reveals something essential. It shows that emotion is not stored permanently inside memory. It is regenerated each time, and regeneration depends on available resources. When resources are low, regeneration is incomplete. Emotion arrives faint, muted, sometimes not at all. This is why nighttime memories often feel like photographs rather than reenactments. You see the scene, but you are not inside it. You are not reliving it. You are observing it. Observation does not hurt the way participation does. Participation requires emotional immersion. Immersion is costly. Fatigue prevents full immersion. This separation between memory and emotion can feel unsettling. You may wonder if something is wrong, if you are becoming detached, if you are losing something important. But what is happening is not loss. It is redistribution. The brain is prioritizing stability over intensity. It chooses calm over coherence, not because calm is better, but because it is cheaper. This is why tired minds often feel gentle toward old wounds. They no longer have the energy to keep emotion fully attached. The attachment loosens, and loosened things do not pull as hard. Think about how a knot behaves when tension is removed. The knot does not disappear. It simply slackens. Memory knots behave the same way. When emotional tension drops, the knot relaxes. You can still see it, still trace its shape, but it does not constrict. This is what people mean when they say a memory feels less heavy. The weight has not been lifted. The pressure has been released. This release does not come from understanding. It comes from exhaustion. And exhaustion, in this context, is not a flaw. It is a mechanism. The brain cannot maintain maximum emotional coupling indefinitely. It must rest. So it lets the systems drift. Memory without emotion. Emotion without narrative. This drifting creates space. Space is what makes memory tolerable. Without space, memory overwhelms. With space, memory coexists. This is why some people feel closest to their past selves at night. They can look without being pulled back. They can remember without reliving. This creates a strange intimacy. You are close enough to see, but far enough not to be hurt. This is not distance born of avoidance. It is distance born of fatigue. The brain has stopped pulling you into the memory. It allows you to stand beside it. Standing beside a memory feels very different from standing inside it. Inside, everything is immediate. Outside, everything has context. At night, context returns. The brain, no longer forced into urgency, allows memory to sit within a wider frame. The event is no longer the whole world. It is part of it. This contextualization happens without effort. It does not require reframing or reinterpretation. It is a byproduct of slowed processing. When the brain slows, it stops zooming in. It zooms out. Zoomed out memories hurt less, not because they are smaller, but because they are surrounded by space. Space dilutes intensity. This is why nighttime sadness often feels wide rather than sharp. A broad ache instead of a piercing pain. Breath is easier to hold than a point. Points stab. Fields do not. Fatigue turns points into fields. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a functional description of how the brain reallocates attention. High energy creates focus. Low energy creates diffusion. Diffused attention spreads emotion. Spreading emotion reduces intensity. This diffusion is protective. It prevents overload. Without it, the brain would collapse under the weight of accumulated memory. So it uses fatigue as a release valve. At night, the valve opens. Emotion drains slowly. Not completely, but enough. This is why nighttime thoughts often feel sad in a clean way. The sadness is there, but it is not tangled. It does not spiral. It does not demand explanation. It does not ask to be fixed. It simply exists. This existence without demand is deeply soothing, even when the emotion itself is not pleasant. Because suffering is not caused by emotion alone. It is caused by emotion plus resistance. At night, resistance fades. Emotion is allowed to move freely. Movement without obstruction is gentle. You might notice that when emotion is decoupled from memory, self-judgment also weakens. During the day, emotion often turns inward. You blame yourself for feeling it. You question why you are still affected. At night, that meta layer disappears. You feel what you feel without commentary. This absence of commentary is part of the decoupling. Emotion exists without narrative. Without narrative, emotion does not attack the self. It passes through. This is why nighttime tears often feel relieving rather than distressing. They are not part of a story. They are a release of energy without interpretation. Interpretation is heavy. Fatigue drops it. As you lie here, you may notice a memory drifting through awareness. The image is there, but the emotion feels softer. Not gone, just less attached. You are not pulled toward action. You are not pulled toward judgment. You are simply noticing. This noticing is what becomes possible when memory and emotion no longer arrive fused. And as this separation continues, another change begins to take shape. Because when emotion detaches from memory, the memory itself begins to change its role. It stops being something that defines you. It becomes something you carry lightly. And carrying lightly is different from being burdened. The difference is not in the load. It is in the grip. Let the grip stay loose. There is no need to tighten it now. Just notice how the memory rests, how the feeling drifts, how neither insists on anything. This is not the end of anything. It is simply the brain showing you that memory and pain are not the same thing. They only feel inseparable when the system has enough energy to bind them tightly together. Tonight, that binding is relaxed, and in that relaxation, something else is quietly preparing to shift. There is a quiet misconception about forgetting. Most people imagine forgetting as erasure, as if memories dissolve, fade, disappear into some unreachable place. But what actually happens, most of the time, is something else. You do not forget. You stop reacting. And those two experiences feel almost identical from the inside. During the day, reaction is automatic. A memory appears, and the body responds before thought has time to intervene. Muscles tighten. Breath shortens. Attention narrows. This reaction feels inseparable from the memory itself, so you assume the pain is inside the memory. But reaction is not memory. Reaction is a present moment process. It is the nervous system responding to what it believes is happening now. When you are tired, that belief weakens. The nervous system no longer has the energy to treat remembered events as current threats. So reaction slows. Not deliberately, not consciously. It simply does not fire the same way. And without reaction, memory feels different. The image may still be vivid, the details may still be precise, but the body does not mobilize around them. This lack of mobilization is often mistaken for emotional distance, but distance implies separation. What is happening here is not separation. It is stillness. The memory is present. The body is present, but they are no longer locked together. This uncoupling changes the entire experience of remembering. Think about how a sound feels when you stop turning toward it. The sound still exists, but it no longer commands your attention. Memory works the same way. Reaction is what turns memory into an event. Without reaction, memory becomes information. Information does not hurt. It can be sad. It can be heavy, but it does not injure. Injury requires force. Reaction is force. Fatigue removes force. This is why people often say that old memories feel duller at night. Not because they have faded, but because the nervous system is no longer amplifying them. Amplification is costly. It requires arousal. When arousal drops, amplification drops with it. The memory is still being processed, but at a lower gain. Lower gain means lower intensity. Lower intensity feels like gentleness. This is not suppression. Suppression pushes memory away. What happens at night is the opposite. Memory is allowed to remain, without triggering the reflex to act. This allowance feels like peace, but it is not peace born of resolution. It is peace born of non-engagement. There is an important distinction here. During the day, engagement feels necessary. The brain assumes that if something appears in awareness, it must require action. Analyze it, fix it, defend against it. This assumption keeps the system alert. At night, the assumption collapses. Nothing requires action. The body is horizontal. The environment is stable, so the brain stops asking, "What do I need to do about this?" And without that question, reaction subsides. Reaction is always tied to doing. When doing disappears, reaction fades. This is why nighttime memories often feel oddly complete, not because they have been resolved, but because nothing more is required of you. No response, no explanation, just presence. Presence without demand is soothing, even when the content is painful. You may notice that when a memory appears at night, there is a moment where you expect the reaction to follow. A tightening, a spike. But it doesn't come. There is a pause, and in that pause, something becomes clear. You were not hurt by the memory itself. You were hurt by what your body did in response to it. This realization can feel destabilizing. It suggests that suffering is not contained in the past. It is generated in the present. And generation depends on energy. When energy is low, generation fails. This failure feels like relief, but it also reveals something unsettling. If pain depends on reaction, and reaction depends on energy, then pain is not fixed. It is conditional. This does not make pain imaginary. It makes it dynamic. The same memory can produce different experiences, depending on the state of the system that encounters it. At night, the system is slowed. Slowed systems react less. Less reaction means less suffering. This does not mean the brain is choosing peace. It is choosing efficiency. Reaction is inefficient when there is nothing to respond to. So the brain stops reacting. This is why nighttime remembering often feels strangely neutral. Not happy, not resolved, just calm. Calm is not an emotion. It is a lack of disturbance. Disturbance requires reaction. When reaction fades, calm emerges automatically. You do not have to create it. It is the default state of a system not under threat. At night, the brain treats memory as non-threatening, not because it trusts it, but because it no longer has the capacity to distrust it. Distrust requires vigilance. Vigilance requires energy. Fatigue removes energy. So distrust collapses. And in its absence, reaction fades. You might notice that this state allows you to remember things you could not tolerate during the day. Not because they have become easier, but because the body is no longer flaring. This creates the illusion of strength. You feel as though you can handle the memory now. But handling implies control. What is happening is not control. It is passivity. The memory is not being handled. It is being left alone. This difference matters. Control keeps memory active. Passivity lets it rest. Resting memories do not provoke. They simply occupy space. This occupation can feel peaceful, but it can also feel strange. You may wonder why something that once caused so much pain now feels almost ordinary. The answer is not growth. It is exhaustion. And exhaustion, in this context, is not failure. It is the nervous system stepping down from high alert. High alert is not sustainable. So the system has an off-ramp. Fatigue is that off-ramp. At night, you exit vigilance. And without vigilance, reaction dissolves. This is why nighttime insight feels profound. You are seeing memory without reaction. This is rare. During the day, reaction obscures perception. At night, perception clears because reaction is absent. But this clarity is fragile. It depends on the system remaining quiet. When morning comes, energy returns, and reaction returns with it. The same memory may hurt again. This does not invalidate the calm you felt at night. It simply means the system has changed states. States are not truths. They are conditions. And conditions shape experience. Understanding this can soften how you relate to your own emotional fluctuations. You are not inconsistent. You are state-dependent. The brain experiences memory differently, depending on how much energy it has available. At night, energy is low, so reaction is low, and memory becomes tolerable. This tolerability is not indifference. You still care, but caring without reacting feels very different from caring while bracing. Bracing creates pain. Relaxation allows feeling without injury. You may notice now that the memory you are holding does not demand anything from you. It does not require explanation. It does not require forgiveness. It does not require resolution. It is simply there, and you are simply here. Two things existing without collision. This is what happens when reaction steps aside. And as reaction continues to fade, another subtle change begins. Because when the body stops reacting, the mind stops trying to control. And when control weakens, something else quietly emerges. A different way of being with memory. Not as something to manage, not as something to overcome, but as something that can be allowed to pass through consciousness without leaving a mark. That shift is still forming. You do not need to follow it. Just notice the stillness where reaction used to be. Notice how memory can exist without pulling your body into it. And notice how, in this quiet state, the memory feels less like a threat and more like a trace. A trace does not demand defense. It simply remains. And remaining without reaction is already a kind of rest. There is a moment, subtle and easily missed, when the sense of self begins to loosen, not disappear, not dissolve, just thin. This does not happen through insight. It does not require reflection. It does not arrive because you understand something new. It arrives because you are tired. During the day, the self is dense. It has weight, edges, boundaries. It knows where it begins and where it ends. It knows what belongs to it and what does not. It knows what must be defended. This density is not psychological in origin. It is neurological. The waking brain invests energy in maintaining a stable sense of identity. It tracks continuity. It reinforces narrative. This is who I am. This is what happened to me. This is what it means. These statements feel philosophical, but they are supported by constant neural effort. The self is not a static thing. It is an active construction. And construction requires energy. At night, that energy fades. The brain begins to withdraw resources from identity maintenance, not because identity is no longer important, but because it is no longer immediately necessary. You are not negotiating the world. You are not asserting yourself. You are not protecting a position. So the machinery that keeps the self rigid starts to idle. And as it does, something remarkable happens. The boundaries that once made memory personal begin to soften. The memory is still there, but it no longer presses so hard against the idea of me. This is why nighttime memories often feel less self-defining. Not because they matter less, but because the self they once threatened is quieter. When the self quiets, memory loses leverage. During the day, memory hurts largely because it collides with identity. This happened to me. This says something about who I am. This changes how I must see myself. These collisions create friction. Friction creates pain. At night, the self recedes just enough. To prevent that collision, the memory passes through awareness, without striking identity head-on. This is not detachment. Detachment implies separation. What happens here is diffusion. The self spreads out. It becomes less concentrated. And diffused things do not bruise easily. Philosophers have struggled for centuries to describe states where the self loosens. They call it humility, surrender, ego death. But these terms imply intention. What happens at night is unintentional. It is not spiritual. It is metabolic. The brain, conserving energy, lets the self relax. And when the self relaxes, the need to defend it disappears. Defense is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance. Who am I? What do I stand for? What does this mean about me? These questions fade as fatigue deepens, not because they are answered, but because the system that asks them has gone quiet. This quiet can feel strangely relieving, not euphoric, not transcendent, just lighter. You may notice that you care less about being right at night, less about being justified, less about how things should have been. This is not wisdom. It is reduced self-density. And reduced self-density changes how pain is experienced. Pain requires a center, something that feels injured. When the center softens, pain has nowhere to land. It still exists, but it floats. This floating pain is what many people describe as sad but okay. The sadness is there, but it does not define you. It does not demand correction. It is just one sensation among many. This is why nighttime sadness often feels cleaner, less tangled with identity, less bound to self-judgment. During the day, sadness often triggers a second layer of pain. Why am I still like this? What does this say about me? At night, that second layer disappears. The self is too tired to judge itself. So sadness remains single-layered. Single-layered emotions are easier to hold. They do not spiral. They do not multiply. They simply pass. This thinning of the self also explains why people sometimes feel more compassionate at night, not just toward others, toward themselves. Compassion does not arise from moral effort here. It arises from the absence of self-defense. When the self is not rigid, it does not feel as threatened. And when it does not feel threatened, it does not need to harden. Hardness is a response to danger. At night, danger feels far away. So, hardness melts. This melting does not mean boundaries disappear. It means they become permeable. Memories can move through without tearing. Feelings can arise without being resisted. Thoughts can appear without being challenged. This permeability is temporary. By morning, the self will gather itself again. It will regain density. Boundaries will return. The memory may hurt again. This does not mean the night was an illusion. It means the night revealed something conditional. That pain is not just about what happened. It is about how tightly the self is held. When the self is clenched, memory cuts. When the self relaxes, memory softens. You might notice now that thinking about yourself feels different than it did earlier. Less like a solid object, more like a presence. Presence does not need to be defended. Objects do. This is the difference. At night, you experience yourself more as presence than as object. And presence does not collide with memory. It allows memory to pass through. This is why nighttime reflection often feels spacious, not because answers are found, but because the self has stepped back. In that space, memory is no longer forced to negotiate with identity. It can simply exist. This existence without negotiation is gentle, not comforting, just non-violent. You may notice that the memory you have been carrying no longer feels like an attack on who you are. It feels like something that happened in a wider field. A field that includes you, but is not defined by you. This widening is subtle. It does not announce itself. It is felt as ease, as the absence of internal struggle, and this ease is not a conclusion. It does not mean anything has been resolved. It is a state created by fatigue. And states pass. But even temporary states can teach something important. They show what is possible. When the self is not working so hard to remain intact, as you remain here with the self slightly loosened, notice how memory behaves. Notice how it no longer demands identity. Notice how it no longer asks you to define yourself in relation to it. It is simply there, and you are simply here. Two presences, sharing space. Without conflict, this is not the end of suffering, but it is a pause. A pause created not by effort, but by rest. And in this pause, another shift is beginning. Because when the self loosens and memory no longer presses against it, the brain begins to experience something unexpected. Not relief, not resolution, but a quiet sense of enough. Not enough answers, enough resistance, enough holding, enough doing. And that sense that it is enough to simply be here with what happened is still unfolding. You do not need to follow it. Just notice the space it creates. Notice how the self feels lighter. Notice how memory feels less personal. Notice how nothing needs to be fixed right now. That noticing is enough for this moment, and the moment is still moving. There is a quiet shift that happens once the self has loosened. Not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable if you stay with it long enough. The brain stops trying to protect the memory. During the day, protection is constant. The brain guards memories the way it guards open wounds, by keeping them covered, monitored, interpreted. Protection looks like avoidance, or rumination, or control. All of these are ways the brain tries to make sure the memory does not surprise you. Surprise is dangerous. So the brain rehearses, replays, keeps the memory sharp and ready. A sharp memory is predictable. You know exactly how it will hurt. But at night, something changes. As the self loosens and reaction fades, the brain no longer feels the need to guard the memory. Guarding requires vigilance. Vigilance requires energy. Fatigue removes both, so the memory is left unattended. This unattended state is important. An unattended memory behaves differently. It is no longer curated, no longer framed to protect you, no longer shaped to fit a narrative. It is simply there. And when memory is not being guarded, it begins to lose its role as a threat. Threats must be watched. If something is not being watched, the brain no longer treats it as dangerous. This is why nighttime memories often feel exposed but not harmful. You are seeing them without armor, but you are also seeing them without fear. Fear requires anticipation. Anticipation requires attention. Fatigue scatters attention. So fear fades. This is not courage. Courage implies choice. What happens here is neglect. The brain is neglecting the memory, not because it does not matter, but because it no longer has the resources to care in the same way. This neglect is not cruel. It is neutral. And neutrality is powerful. When the brain stops guarding a memory, it also stops shaping it. During the day, memories are constantly edited, details emphasized, moments replayed, meanings reinforced. These edits keep the memory aligned with the brain's current goals: protection, control, identity. At night, editing stops. The brain allows the memory to exist in a rawer form, not raw in intensity, but raw in structure, unorganized, unpolished, unresolved. This rawness feels different. There is less narrative, less explanation. You remember without telling yourself why it mattered. This is why nighttime memories often feel incomplete. They do not come with conclusions. They do not arrive wrapped in lessons. They are fragments. Fragments do not hurt the way stories do. Stories give memory direction. Fragments simply appear. This lack of direction removes urgency, and urgency is what makes memory feel alive. Without urgency, memory feels old, not distant in time, but distant in force. You might notice that at night, a memory that once demanded attention now feels content to sit quietly. It does not insist on being understood. It does not ask you to do anything with it. This is the result of being unguarded. The brain has stopped assigning the memory a job. During the day, memory always has a job: warn you, protect you, define you. At night, memory is unemployed, and unemployed memories rest. Resting memories soften, not because they change, but because nothing is pulling on them. Think about how an object behaves when no one is holding it. It settles. Memory settles the same way. This settling can feel like relief, but it can also feel unsettling. You may wonder why something that once felt so important now feels oddly quiet. You may question whether you are minimizing your own experience, but nothing is being minimized. The memory has simply been released from duty. Duty is heavy. Fatigue removes duty. This release allows another shift to occur. When the brain stops guarding memory, it also stops expecting it to harm you. Expectation of harm is what triggers preemptive defense. Defense tightens the system. Tight systems amplify sensation. At night, the system is loose. Loose systems absorb impact, so memory lands softly. This softness is not because the memory is gentle. It is because the system receiving it is flexible. Flexibility reduces damage. This is why you can think about painful things at night without being overwhelmed. You are not bracing. You are not anticipating. You are not preparing to be hurt. Preparation is exhausting. Fatigue cancels it. There is something quietly revealing about this. It suggests that much of what we experience as pain is not caused by the memory itself, but by the brain's expectation of pain. Expectation primes the system. Primed systems react strongly. At night, priming is low, so reaction is low. The memory does not hit a prepared surface. It lands on something soft. This softness allows memory to be experienced without escalation. You may notice that the memory feels less personal now, not because it does not involve you, but because it is no longer aimed at you. During the day, memory often feels accusatory. It points, it reminds, it demands. At night, the pointing stops. The memory no longer addresses you directly. It exists in the same space as you, but it is not speaking to you. This silence is important. Memories hurt most when they speak. When they say something about who you are, what you lost, what you failed to protect. At night, memory loses its voice. It becomes an image, a sensation, a trace. Traces do not accuse. They simply remain. This remaining can feel intimate, even tender, because without accusation, there is no need to defend. Defense is what makes pain sharp. Without defense, pain becomes manageable. Not pleasant, but bearable. You might notice that at night, you are able to hold contradictory feelings about a memory without needing to resolve them. Sadness without anger, longing without blame, regret without self-attack. These combinations feel impossible during the day. They require the brain to tolerate ambiguity. Ambiguity is expensive. Fatigue allows it by default. When the brain is too tired to simplify, it lets complexity exist. And complexity, paradoxically, is gentler than rigid narratives. Rigid narratives demand alignment. Complexity allows coexistence. Coexistence does not require force. This is why nighttime remembering can feel strangely compassionate. Not because you have decided to be compassionate, but because the brain has stopped enforcing a single interpretation. Multiple truths can exist at once. And when nothing has to win, nothing has to hurt as much. This does not mean you are seeing the memory more accurately. Accuracy is not the point. The point is that the memory is no longer being used. Unused things rest. Resting things soften. You may notice that the memory now feels less like something that happened to you and more like something that happened around you. This shift reduces impact. Impact required direct contact. Distance, even slight distance, changes the experience. At night, the distance comes not from avoidance, but from the absence of guarding. The brain has stepped back, and in stepping back, it has allowed memory to occupy space without confrontation. This is not a solution. It is not a resolution. It is a pause created by fatigue. But pauses matter. They show what is possible. When the brain is not actively interfering, when memory is left alone, it often becomes less aggressive. Not because it has changed, but because it is no longer being sharpened. Sharpening is work. Fatigue stops the work. As you remain here, notice how the memory feels now. Notice how it no longer demands attention. Notice how it does not try to prove anything. Notice how it simply exists. This is the brain allowing memory to be what it is, without turning it into a task. And in that allowance, another subtle transformation is beginning. Because once memory is no longer guarded and no longer sharpened, it begins to slow. And slowing changes everything. The pace of memory is about to shift. You do not need to follow it. Just let the memory rest where it is, unprotected, unemployed, unhurried. And notice how, in this stillness, the memory feels less like something that could hurt you, and more like something that is already finished happening. Speed is rarely questioned. It is assumed. Thoughts move quickly during the day, and because they move quickly, they feel sharp. Sharpness is not a property of content. It is a property of velocity. The faster something moves through the mind, the harder it hits. This is easy to miss because speed feels natural when energy is high. During the day, the brain operates in a fast loop. Perception triggers interpretation. Interpretation triggers reaction. Reaction feeds back into perception. The cycle tightens. Memory enters this loop and is immediately accelerated. It is replayed quickly, judged quickly, linked quickly to other memories. As speed compresses experience, compression increases intensity. This is why a single thought can suddenly feel overwhelming. Not because it contains too much, but because it is moving too fast to be absorbed gently. At night, speed changes. Not abruptly, not uniformly, but unmistakably. As fatigue deepens, the brain loses the ability to maintain rapid cycling. Neural communication slows. Attention becomes less precise. Transitions between thoughts lengthen. This slowing is often described as mental fog. But fog is not emptiness. It is diffusion. And diffusion changes how memory behaves. A fast memory feels like an attack. A slow memory feels like a presence. The same content, different velocity. This is why nighttime remembering often feels drawn out. A memory unfolds gradually. Details arrive one at a time. Images linger longer. Nothing rushes. There is space between one moment and the next, and in that space, sharpness disappears. Sharpness depends on suddenness. Suddenness startles the nervous system. Startle triggers reaction. Reaction amplifies pain. When memory slows, startle disappears. Without startle, the body does not brace. Without bracing, the memory does not injure. This is not because the memory is gentle. It is because it is moving at a speed the system can tolerate. Think about the difference between being struck by something and having it rest against you. The object does not change. The speed does. At night, memory rests. During the day, memory strikes. This difference is entirely about timing. Fatigue stretches time, not objectively, but experientially. Moments feel longer. Transitions feel softer. The brain, unable to jump quickly from one state to another, moves in slower arcs. Memory enters these arcs and slows with them. This slowing has an unexpected effect. It allows the brain to feel memory without being overwhelmed. Fast memories overwhelm because they arrive before the system can prepare. Slow memories give the system time to adjust. Adjustment reduces impact. This is why nighttime sadness often feels deep but not piercing. It spreads rather than concentrates. Spread out emotions are easier to hold. Concentrated emotions burn. Speed concentrates. Slowness disperses. During the day, the brain concentrates experience to make decisions quickly. At night, decision-making is unnecessary. So, concentration relaxes. The brain stops compressing experience. Memory is allowed to expand. Expansion reduces force. Force is what hurts. This is why you may notice that at night, you can stay with a memory longer without distress. Not because the memory is less painful, but because it is arriving at a pace you can breathe with. Breathing matters here. Slow memories synchronize with slow breathing. The nervous system reads this synchronization as safety. Safety reduces defensive activation. Without defense, memory is experienced more fully and more gently at the same time. This is a paradox. We assume that to feel something fully is to suffer. But suffering is not fullness. It is overload. Overload happens when experience arrives faster than the system can process. At night, the system slows. Processing catches up. Memory no longer outruns the body's capacity to absorb it. This creates a strange sense of intimacy. You are closer to the memory, but it hurts less. Closeness without speed is tenderness. Speed without closeness is shock. During the day, memory often shocks. At night, it touches. This touching can feel emotional, sometimes even raw, but it is not violent. Violence requires force. Force requires acceleration. Fatigue removes acceleration. This slowing also changes how the brain links memories together. During the day, one memory quickly triggers another. Associations cascade. Before you know it, you are far from where you started. This cascade amplifies emotion. Each link adds weight. At night, associations weaken. The brain is too tired to leap rapidly from one memory to the next. So memories appear more isolated. One scene, one moment. It arrives, lingers, then fades. It does not immediately summon its entire network. This isolation reduces overwhelm. Instead of facing a whole history at once, you face a single fragment. Fragments are manageable. Histories are heavy. Fatigue breaks histories into moments. Moments can be felt. This is why nighttime memories often feel simpler. Not simplified in meaning, but simplified in scope. You are not reliving your entire story. You are touching one point in it. That point does not define everything. It is just a point. Speed is what turns points into lines, lines into narratives, narratives into identity. Slowness breaks that chain. It leaves you with a moment instead of a conclusion. This is profoundly soothing, not because the moment is pleasant, but because it does not demand interpretation. Interpretation accelerates thought. Acceleration reintroduces pain. At night, interpretation stalls. The brain does not rush to explain what the memory means. It does not rush to connect it to who you are. It lets the memory exist at its own pace. This pace is slower than thought, closer to sensation. Sensation unfolds gradually. It does not arrive all at once, and gradual things rarely hurt. They can be intense, but intensity without speed is depth, not injury. This is why nighttime feelings often feel deep rather than sharp. Depth can be held. Sharpness cuts. The difference is time. You might notice now that as you think of a memory, it feels as though it is moving slowly through awareness, not forcing itself forward, not retreating, just drifting. Drift is slow by nature. Drifting objects do not collide. They pass by. This passing is what gives nighttime memories their gentle quality. They are not fixed. They are not frozen. They are moving, but at a pace that does not overwhelm. This movement without urgency allows something else to happen. You stop trying to get ahead of the memory. During the day, you often try to outrun painful thoughts or brace for them. Both require anticipation. Anticipation accelerates time. At night, anticipation fades. You are no longer trying to get somewhere, so the memory does not need to hurry. Hurrying is what makes memory dangerous. When memory slows, it becomes something you can accompany. Walking beside a memory is different from being dragged by it. At night, you walk. During the day, you are often pulled. This is not a choice. It is a consequence of energy. High energy pulls. Low energy allows walking. Walking memories feel gentle. They do not surprise you. They do not ambush. They move at your pace. This shared pace creates a sense of safety. Safety does not remove pain. It changes how pain is felt. Pain felt slowly is tolerable. Pain felt suddenly is shocking. At night, pain is slow. This is why old memories feel less dangerous. Not because they are less real, but because they are no longer rushing towards you. They approach gradually. They leave gradually. Nothing snaps. Nothing spikes. As you lie here, you may notice that time itself feels different. Moments stretch. Thoughts elongate. There is less pressure to move on to the next thing. This temporal softness is not boredom. It is relief. Relief from speed. Speed is the silent amplifier of suffering. Fatigue turns the volume down by slowing everything. And as everything slows, memory changes its shape. It stops being a weapon. It becomes a landscape. Landscapes are wide. You can stand in them without being hurt. They may be barren. They may be sad, but they do not strike. This is the transformation that slowness brings. Not resolution, not healing, just a change in tempo. And tempo matters more than content, because content does not hurt on its own. Speed does. As this slowing continues, as memory drifts rather than rushes, another shift begins to form. Because once memory is slow enough, the brain no longer needs to push it away. It can stay with it, not to solve it, not to change it, just to be near it without being overwhelmed. That closeness, without urgency, is still developing. You do not need to reach for it. Just notice how the memory moves now. Notice how it does not hurry. Notice how it does not pull you. Notice how you are not bracing. This is what happens when time stretches and the mind finally moves slowly enough to keep pace with itself. There is a quiet illusion that strength lives in alertness, that the more awake you are, the more capable you become of handling what hurts. But the night tells a different story. At night, when strength fades, pain often does too. Not because it is defeated, but because it no longer has something to press against. During the day, the brain is taught. Even when you feel calm, there is a background tension holding everything in place. A readiness to respond. A readiness to correct. A readiness to intervene. This readiness feels like control, and control feels like safety. So the brain holds on to it tightly. But control has a cost. It keeps memory sharp. It keeps emotion activated. It keeps the past alive in the present. When you are fully awake, your mind does not merely remember. It stands guard. And standing guard requires constant energy. You monitor yourself. You monitor others. You monitor the meaning of what happened. This monitoring turns memory into a living thing. It keeps moving, keeps reacting, keeps demanding attention. But when fatigue arrives, the guard steps down. Not heroically, not intentionally, just because it cannot stand any longer. And when the guard steps down, something unexpected happens. The memory does not attack. It does not surge forward. It does not collapse the system. It simply stays where it is. This is why tiredness often feels like relief, even when nothing has been resolved. You are not stronger. You are less defended, and paradoxically, that makes you feel safer. There is a common belief that to survive pain, you must be alert. But alertness amplifies pain. Alert systems detect threats quickly. They react intensely. Pain thrives in alertness. Fatigue dulls the edge, not by weakening you, but by removing the stance that pain requires. Pain needs resistance. It needs the system to say, "This must not be here." When you are tired, the system stops saying that, not because it agrees, but because disagreement requires energy, so the memory remains, without opposition. And without opposition, there is no struggle. This is why, at night, you can think about something devastating and feel strangely okay. Not good, not happy, but not shattered. The absence of shattering is not numbness. It is the absence of force. Force is generated by the brain's attempt to stay upright. Fatigue lets the brain lie down. Lying down changes the angle of everything. Problems look different when you are no longer standing against them. They do not loom. They spread. This spreading reduces pressure. Pressure is what makes pain feel unbearable. At night, pressure dissipates. You might notice that when you are exhausted, you stop trying to win against your memories. During the day, memory feels like something to overcome. You push through it. You reason with it. You try to dominate it. This struggle makes memory powerful. At night, there is no struggle. The mind does not have the energy to fight, so it does the only thing it can do. It allows. Allowance is not acceptance. Acceptance implies agreement. Allowance is simply the absence of resistance. And absence of resistance is gentle by default. You may notice that at night, you do not argue with yourself about how you should feel. You do not criticize yourself for still being affected. You do not demand progress. Demand requires strength. Fatigue removes demand. This is why nighttime self-talk often feels kinder. Not because you have learned compassion, but because the system that enforces standards has gone quiet. Standards are exhausting. So are expectations. So are ideals about how healed you should be. At night, these ideals collapse. And when they collapse, memory is no longer measured against them. It does not fail. It does not succeed. It simply exists. This existence without evaluation is profoundly soothing. Evaluation is what turns memory into a test. Tests create anxiety. Anxiety sharpens pain. At night, there is no test, so anxiety fades, and with it, pain loses intensity. You may realize something unsettling here. That much of what hurts during the day hurts because you are trying to be okay, trying to be better, trying to be past it. Trying keeps memory active. It keeps the wound open. At night, you stop trying, not because you have given up, but because you cannot continue. And in that stopping, the wound finally rests. Rest does not heal instantly, but it stops aggravating the injury. Aggravation is what keeps pain sharp. Fatigue removes aggravation. This is why tired people often feel closer to peace than energized ones, not because they have clarity, but because they have stopped interfering. Interference is heavy. Non-interference is light. This does not mean fatigue is desirable. It means fatigue reveals something. It shows that pain is not only about what happened. It is about how actively you are engaging with it. High engagement increases pain. Low engagement softens it. At night, engagement drops, so pain drops with it. This is not a strategy. You cannot force this state. If you try to be less engaged, you are already engaging. Fatigue is involuntary. That is why it works. It bypasses effort. It bypasses intention. It bypasses the part of the mind that keeps wounds alive in the name of protection. There is something quietly humbling about this. It suggests that suffering is often maintained by our best efforts, by vigilance, by awareness, by control. These qualities are useful during the day. They help you survive, but they also keep memory sharp. At night, survival mode shuts down, and when survival shuts down, memory is no longer a threat. You might notice now that the memory you have been carrying feels less urgent. It is still there, but it is not asking anything of you. This is not because you are ready. It is because the system has stepped out of readiness. Readiness is exhausting. Rest is not active. Rest allows things to settle. Settled things do not hurt as much. This is why people often fear rest. They worry that if they stop being alert, they will be overwhelmed. But often the opposite is true. Alertness is what overwhelms. Rest allows experience to distribute itself gently. During the day, the brain concentrates experience to respond quickly. At night, the brain diffuses experience to survive quietly. Diffusion softens pain, not by changing it, but by spreading it thin enough that it no longer cuts. You might notice that the memory now feels almost ordinary. Still sad, still meaningful, but no longer sharp. This ordinariness can feel disappointing. We expect pain to feel dramatic. When it does not, we question its validity. But ordinariness is not dismissal. It is normalization. The memory has returned to its place. Among many other experiences, it is no longer standing alone, demanding attention. This return is gentle, not triumphant, just quiet. As you rest here, notice how little effort is required now to stay with the memory. You are not bracing. You are not rehearsing. You are not preparing to be hurt. You are simply present. This presence without vigilance is what fatigue offers. Not answers, not solutions, just the removal of force. And in the absence of force, pain loses its shape. It becomes something you can coexist with, instead of something you must defeat. This coexistence is not permanent. Morning will come, energy will return, and with it, the old patterns may reappear. But this moment matters, because it shows what is possible. When the system stops trying to be strong, when strength steps aside, gentleness appears on its own, not as a virtue, as a consequence. And as this gentleness settles, another quiet question begins to form. If pain fades when strength fades, what have you been using your strength for all along? You do not need to answer that. Just let it rest. Like everything else tonight, unforced, unheld, allowed. There is a moment when the brain gives up on reconstruction. not memory itself, but the effort to rebuild it. During the day, remembering is rarely passive. The brain does not simply retrieve an event. It reconstructs it, piece by piece, angle by angle, emotion by emotion. This reconstruction is not about accuracy. It is about control. The brain rebuilds the past in order to understand it, to position itself inside it, to make sure it knows where it stands. Every time a memory appears while you are awake, the brain asks a quiet question. How should this feel now? And then it answers that question by assembling the memory in a particular way. Tone, meaning, emphasis, all of it adjusted to fit the present state of the self. This rebuilding is work, invisible work, relentless work, and it is one of the main reasons memories remain painful long after the events themselves are over. Because the past is never simply remembered. It is rebuilt again and again. But fatigue interrupts this process. Not gently, not philosophically. It interrupts it by making it impossible. Reconstruction requires coordination. It requires multiple systems to fire together. It requires timing. When you are tired, timing breaks down. The brain no longer has the precision to reconstruct experience with the same intensity, so it stops trying. This is why nighttime memories often feel incomplete. You remember fragments, but not the full emotional architecture. The brain retrieves pieces, but does not assemble them into a coherent structure. It lets them remain scattered. Scattered memories are very different from reconstructed ones. They do not carry the same force. Force comes from cohesion, when elements lock together image, emotion, meaning, identity, the memory becomes solid. Solidity hurts. At night, solidity dissolves. The memory does not disappear. It loosens. It loses its internal glue. This is why nighttime remembering often feels like watching debris drift in water. You see pieces, you recognize them, but they do not form a weapon. They float. This floating is not dissociation. Dissociation removes you. What happens here keeps you present, but it removes the structure that once made the memory dangerous. During the day, reconstruction keeps memory alive as a system. At night, the system collapses. And without a system, the memory cannot function the way it used to. It no longer tells a story. Stories require structure. They require sequence, causality, purpose. Fatigue disrupts all of these. Time feels less linear. Causality weakens. Purpose fades. So memory loses its narrative form. And without narrative, memory loses authority. Authority is what makes memory instructive. What tells you who you are, what you should feel, what must never happen again. At night, memory stops instructing. It stops giving orders. It stops explaining itself. It simply exists. This existence without instruction is gentle, not pleasant, just quiet. You might notice that when a memory appears now, it does not pull you into a reenactment. There is no urge to replay conversations word for word, no urge to imagine alternative endings. Those urges require reconstruction. They require the brain to rebuild the scene in full. Fatigue removes that capacity, so the memory remains partial. Partial memories are less immersive. Immersion is what makes memory painful. When you are immersed, you are not remembering the past. You are reliving it. At night, reliving becomes difficult. The brain does not have the resources, so memory stays on the surface. Surface memories do not drown you. They touch. They ripple. Then they move on. This is why nighttime remembering often feels safer. Not because the content is safe, but because the system that could drag you under is offline. There is no reconstruction, no full simulation, just recognition. Recognition without simulation is calm. Simulation requires energy. Energy is low. So, simulation stops. This also explains why nighttime insights often feel fleeting. You sense something important, but you cannot fully articulate it. This is not because the insight is vague. It is because articulation requires reconstruction, language, logic, sequence. The tired brain cannot assemble these cleanly, so insights remain impressions. Impressions do not harden. They pass through. This passing quality is part of what makes night feel gentle. Nothing sticks long enough to wound, even painful memories. They appear, hover, and dissolve. This dissolution is not repression. Repression pushes things away. What happens here is the opposite. The memory is allowed to appear. It is simply not rebuilt into something sharp. This difference matters. Suppressed memories are dangerous. They build pressure. Unreconstructed memories are safe. They lack force. Force comes from coherence. Coherence requires energy. Fatigue breaks coherence. You may notice that when you try to hold on to a memory at night, it resists. Not violently. It just slips. You cannot keep it fully formed. Details blur. Connections loosen. This slipping can feel frustrating. You might think you are losing something, but what you are losing is not the memory. You are losing the grip. Grip is what made the memory painful. Without grip, memory cannot maintain shape. It softens. Think about how ice behaves when heat is applied. It does not vanish instantly. It loses structure. Edges round. Surface smooths. The ice becomes water. Memory behaves similarly under fatigue. The structure melts. The content remains. Water does not cut. It flows. This flow is what you feel at night. Thoughts do not lock together. They move. Movement without structure is soothing. It does not trap. This is why nighttime thinking feels less obsessive. Obsession requires tight loops. Loops require structure. Structure collapses when energy drops. So loops break. And broken loops release pressure. This release is often experienced as emotional relief. But it is not because anything has been solved. Nothing has been fixed. The system that kept the problem active has simply shut down. This is a critical point. The brain does not need to resolve memory in order to reduce suffering. It only needs to stop reconstructing it. Reconstruction keeps memory current. Without reconstruction, memory becomes past. Not conceptually, physiologically. The body stops responding as if the event is happening now, because it is no longer being simulated. Simulation is what makes memory feel present. At night, simulation fails. And when simulation fails, the body rests. This is why your heart does not race when you remember something painful at night. Why your muscles do not tense. Why your breath remains slow. The body is not being told that anything is happening, only that something once did. This distinction is everything. Pain lives in now. Memory lives in then. Reconstruction collapses, then into now. Fatigue separates them again. That separation feels like relief, not because the memory is gone, but because it is finally where it belongs. In the past, you might notice now that the memory feels quieter, not because you are avoiding it, but because it is no longer being built into the present. It is not knocking on the door. It is sitting in the distance, still visible, still real, but not demanding entry. This is what happens when the brain stops trying to rebuild the past, as if it still needs to be defended against. Defense is exhausting. Fatigue ends defense. And when defense ends, memory no longer needs to be reconstructed. It can remain what it is. A trace, a mark, something that happened, not something that is happening. As you rest here, notice how little effort it takes now to let the memory be. You are not holding it together. You are not keeping it alive. You are not preventing it from falling apart. You are simply allowing it to drift. This drifting is not loss. It is relief. Because what falls apart at night is not memory itself. but the machinery that kept it sharp. And with that machinery quiet, the brain enters a different relationship with the past. Not one of vigilance, not one of control, but one of coexistence. Coexistence does not require rebuilding. It does not require explanation. It only requires space. And space is abundant. When the mind is finally too tired to keep everything tightly assembled, this is not the end of the memory. It is the end of reconstruction. And in that ending, a different kind of remembering begins. Slower, looser, less dangerous. Not because the past has changed, but because the brain has stopped trying to keep it alive in the present. There is a kind of strength that lives inside anger. Not loud strength, not explosive strength. A quiet, sustaining strength. The strength required to keep something sharp. Anger does not erupt on its own. It is maintained. It requires energy to stay alive, to keep replaying what should not have happened, to keep the boundaries firm, to keep the memory pointed outward, like a warning sign. During the day, that energy is available. The body is upright. The nervous system is engaged. The mind is alert enough to keep the edges intact. So anger stays sharp. It feels justified, necessary, protective, and in many ways, it is. Anger keeps you from forgetting too quickly. It keeps you from minimizing what hurt you. It keeps you from stepping back into danger unprepared. But anger has a cost. It consumes energy continuously. It must be fed with attention, with rehearsal, with vigilance. You cannot be angry passively. Anger is work. At night, that work becomes too heavy. Fatigue does not argue with anger. It does not reason it away. It simply outlasts it. The body no longer has the strength required to keep the emotional muscles flexed. So they relax. And when they relax, anger changes shape. It does not disappear. It loses its teeth. You may notice this as a strange softening. The memory is still unfair, still wrong, still painful, but the urge to clench around it fades, not because you decided to let go, but because letting go is the only thing the system can afford. Holding on costs too much. This is why anger often dissolves late at night, not in dramatic forgiveness, not in resolution, but in quiet fatigue. You stop fueling it, and without fuel, anger cannot maintain its form. It slumps. It dulls. It becomes something else. Sometimes sadness. Sometimes distance. Sometimes nothing at all. This transition can feel confusing. People often mistake the loss of anger for betrayal of the self. They worry that if the anger fades, the pain will be invalidated. But what is actually happening is far more physical than moral. The nervous system is conserving energy. Anger requires readiness. It prepares the body for action, for defense, for confrontation. At night, action is unnecessary, so readiness shuts down. And without readiness, anger has no function. It is like a guard on duty after the threat is past. Eventually, the guard sits down, not because the threat was imagined, but because constant vigilance is unsustainable. This sitting down is what you feel as softness, not forgiveness, not acceptance, just the absence of force. Force is what made the anger sharp. Without force, anger becomes blunt, and blunt things do not cut deeply. This is why memories that once felt infuriating can feel almost neutral when you are exhausted. You still know they mattered, but you no longer feel the need to defend against them. Defense is expensive. Fatigue removes the budget. There is also something else happening here. When anger weakens, the memory loses its role as a warning. Warnings require clarity and intensity. They must be unmistakable. At night, clarity fades. Intensity fades. So the memory stops functioning as a signal. It becomes a recollection instead. Recollections are quieter. They do not demand immediate response. This shift from warning to recollection is one of the most important transformations that fatigue brings. As long as a memory functions as a warning, it must remain sharp. Once it stops being a warning, it is allowed to soften. This is not forgetting. It is retirement. The memory is no longer on active duty, and retired things rest. Resting memories feel gentle, not because they were gentle events, but because they are no longer required to protect you. Protection is heavy. At night, the brain lays it down. You might notice now that the memory you are thinking of no longer feels like something you must guard against. It does not feel like an open threat. It feels closed, not resolved, just inactive. This inactivity is deeply calming. The body recognizes it immediately. Breathing slows. Muscles loosen. The nervous system reads the situation as safe. Safety reduces arousal. Reduced arousal reduces pain. Pain is amplified by arousal. Without arousal, pain dulls. This is why tiredness can feel merciful. It forces the system into safety mode, not by solving the past, but by lowering the intensity of the present. This does not mean anger was wrong. Anger had a purpose. It kept you alert. It kept you aware. It kept the memory from being dismissed too soon. But anger was never meant to be permanent. It is a temporary state, a high-energy state. Fatigue reveals this. When energy runs out, anger cannot continue. And when anger fades, memory loses one of its sharpest edges. This edge, the one that bites hardest, is the sense of injustice. Injustice demands attention. It demands correction. At night, correction is impossible. So injustice softens into something quieter. Not fairness. Not peace. Just stillness. This stillness is not resignation. It is physiological necessity. The body cannot sustain outrage indefinitely, so it rests. And resting removes the bite. You might notice that at night, you can think about someone who hurt you without feeling the same surge of anger. There may still be sadness. There may still be distance, but the heat is gone. Heat requires energy. Fatigue cools everything. This cooling is often mistaken for indifference, but indifference implies lack of care. What you are experiencing is lack of force. You still care. You are just no longer clenching. Clenching is what made the pain sharp. Without clenching, pain becomes dull. Dull pain is tolerable. It does not dominate awareness. It can coexist with rest. This coexistence is what allows sleep to arrive. Sleep cannot come while the system is armed. Anger keeps the system armed. Fatigue disarms it. And in that disarming, memory loses its teeth. Teeth are for biting. Memory without teeth cannot injure. It can still ache. But aching does not wake you up the way biting does. This is why certain thoughts that would have kept you awake earlier now drift through without resistance. They no longer trigger a defensive response. The brain has stopped treating them as dangerous. This does not mean they are harmless. It means the system has chosen rest over vigilance. Rest always wins, eventually. You might notice now that the memory feels less aggressive. It does not approach you. It does not demand a reaction. It is simply present. Presence without aggression is safe. Safety allows the body to relax. Relaxation allows sleep. This is not closure. It is deactivation. And deactivation is enough for now, because the goal at night is not to solve the past. It is to survive the present quietly. Fatigue makes that possible. By taking away the energy required to keep wounds sharp. As you rest here, notice how the memory feels now. Notice how it no longer bites. Notice how it no longer pulls you into alertness. Notice how the anger that once held it tight has loosened its grip. This loosening is not a moral victory. It is a biological one. The system has chosen to conserve itself, and in doing so, it has given you a brief experience of what the memory feels like when it is no longer armed, This experience will not last forever. Morning will come. Energy will return. Some edges may sharpen again, but this moment matters because it shows you something quietly important. That much of what hurts because it is being actively maintained. And when maintenance stops, even the sharpest memories lose their ability to wound. Let that realization rest with you. No need to hold on to it. Fatigue will take care of the rest. There is a quiet misunderstanding about what the night does. People say the night heals. That sleep repairs what the day breaks. That rest fixes what pain damages. But the night does not heal. It does something far simpler and far more subtle. It permits. During the day, the brain is a gatekeeper. It decides what is allowed to enter awareness and what must be kept out. It decides what can be felt now and what must be postponed. This is not repression in the dramatic sense. It is management. The brain manages experience so you can function. It defers grief. It delays sadness. It shelves unfinished emotions. Not forever. Just until later. Later usually means night. At night, the need to manage disappears. You are no longer required to perform. You are no longer required to respond. You are no longer required to hold yourself together. So the gatekeeper steps aside, not because it trusts what comes through, but because there is nothing left to protect. This is where the permission begins. Not permission granted by thought. Not permission given by courage. Permission created by exhaustion. The brain is too tired to say no. And in that inability, something important happens. Experience is allowed to exist without being shaped, resisted, or corrected. This allowance is often mistaken for healing, but healing implies change. What happens at night is not change. It is suspension. The brain suspends its usual interventions. No fixing, no reframing, no improvement, just allowance. Allowance does not alter memory. It alters relationship. During the day, your relationship with memory is active. You lean toward it or away from it. You argue with it. You defend against it. At night, the relationship becomes passive. You stop leaning. And without leaning, there is no struggle. Struggle is what makes memory painful. This is why nighttime remembering feels different. You are not trying to make the memory better. You are not trying to make it worse. You are not trying to make it mean something. You are simply letting it be present. Presence without agenda is gentle, not because it is kind, but because it does not introduce friction. Friction comes from effort. Effort disappears with fatigue. This is the core of nighttime softness, not insight, not wisdom, permission. You allow yourself to feel what you could not feel earlier, because the system that prevents feeling has gone offline. This does not mean the feelings are safe. It means there is no one left to stop them. But without resistance, even difficult feelings soften. They move. They change shape. They do not lodge themselves into the body the same way. During the day, emotion is often stopped halfway, interrupted, redirected. That interruption creates tension. At night, emotion completes its movement. Completion is calming. Incomplete experiences linger. Completed ones pass. This is why nighttime sadness often feels cleaner. It rises. It peaks. It falls. There is no interruption. No self-correction. No attempt to stay functional. Functionality is a daytime requirement. At night, there is no requirement. So experience is allowed to finish. This finishing is not resolution. It is closure of a different kind. Not cognitive closure. Physiological closure. The nervous system allows the wave to pass. Waves that pass do not erode. Waves that are blocked create damage. Daytime blocks. Nighttime releases. This release is what many people describe as emotional relief. But relief here does not come from answers. It comes from letting experience run its course. The brain, when rested enough to manage, interrupts emotion to maintain stability. The brain, when exhausted, lets emotion complete itself. Completion is soothing. You might notice that at night, you can feel something fully, without being overwhelmed. Not because the feeling is smaller, but because it is not being resisted. Resistance splits experience. It creates internal conflict. At night, conflict dissolves, not because sides have reconciled, but because there are no sides left. The system is too tired to divide itself. Division requires energy. Fatigue unifies experience. Feeling is feeling. Memory is memory. There is no commentary layered on top. This unlayered experience feels simple. Simplicity is calming, not because it is pleasant, but because it is not cluttered. Clutter increases suffering. Night clears clutter by turning off management. You might realize something unsettling here. That much of your suffering during the day comes not from what you feel, but from how hard you work to not feel it. Work creates tension. Tension sharpens pain. At night, the work stops. And when the work stops, pain loses its edge. This does not mean the brain endorses what you feel. It simply allows it. Allowance is neutral, but neutrality is powerful. It creates space. In that space, experience rearranges itself, not into something better, just into something less rigid. Rigid experiences hurt. Flexible experiences flow. Nighttime is flexible. The nervous system loosens. Thoughts drift. Feelings spread. Nothing locks in place. This fluidity is what gives night its gentleness. Not the absence of pain, but the absence of resistance. You might notice now that the memory you are holding feels less like something you must endure, and more like something that is passing through. Passing experiences do not endure. They touch, then move on. This movement is the opposite of rumination. Rumination traps experience. It loops. Loops are painful. Fatigue breaks loops by removing the energy required to sustain them. When the loop breaks, experience is freed. Free experience moves. Moving experience changes. Change reduces suffering. This is not therapy. It is biology. The brain is designed to process experience in waves, but waves require room. Daytime constriction limits that room. Nighttime relaxation restores it. This is why you may feel emotional at night, even when nothing specific is happening. The system is catching up, allowing what was postponed, finishing what was interrupted. This finishing feels like softness, but it is not softness in the sentimental sense. It is softness in the mechanical sense. Less tension, less force, less resistance. This mechanical softness has emotional consequences. Memories lose intensity. Feelings lose urgency. The self loosens. All of this happens without effort. Effort would ruin it. You cannot force permission. You can only become too tired to withhold it. This is why trying to let go during the day rarely works. Trying is effort. Effort reinstates control. Control reintroduces pain. At night, you do not try. You cannot. So permission happens naturally. This permission does not heal. It does not change the past, but it changes the present. And the present is where pain is generated. By changing the present state of the system, night changes how the past is experienced. Not permanently, but enough. Enough to rest. Enough to breathe. Enough to sleep. Sleep does not require resolution. It requires safety. Night creates safety by reducing opposition. When nothing is being fought, the system feels safe. And when the system feels safe, it can finally power down. You might notice now that your body feels heavier, not weighed down, anchored. Heaviness is a sign of permission. The muscles stop holding. The breath deepens. The mind stops scanning. Scanning is a form of resistance. At night, scanning fades. And with it, vigilance. Vigilance is the enemy of rest. The night disarms vigilance by making it too expensive to maintain. This is not kindness. It is efficiency. But efficiency feels merciful when you have been holding on too long. You may realize now that nothing is asking you to change. Nothing is asking you to understand. Nothing is asking you to forgive. Those are daytime tasks. At night, the only task is to allow. Allow memory. Allow feeling. Allow yourself to not manage. This allowance is enough. It does not solve your life. It does not fix your story, but it changes how the story sits in your body. And that is everything when it comes to sleep. As you rest here, notice how little effort it takes now to simply be with what happened. Notice how there is no push to improve the feeling. Notice how the feeling is allowed to exist without commentary. This is what the night offers. Not healing, permission. And permission is powerful because it does not demand anything in return. It lets the system do what it knows how to do when it is finally left alone. And as this permission deepens, as experience continues to move without resistance, another subtle shift is approaching. Because once experience is allowed, without being managed, the brain begins to do something unexpected. It begins to let go of ownership. The memory stops being something you hold. It becomes something that holds itself. That transition is already starting. You do not need to follow it. Just stay where you are. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing needs to be fixed. Everything is allowed to pass at its own pace. There is a moment when ownership loosens. Not memory itself, but the feeling that you are the one holding it. During the day, memory feels gripped, contained, managed. You hold it in place. You keep it from spilling. You make sure it stays where it belongs. This holding feels responsible. It feels like care. But holding is effort, and effort creates strain. At night, when fatigue deepens, the hands that were holding begin to relax. Not all at once. Not consciously. They simply tire. And when they tire, something subtle changes. The memory no longer feels like something you are carrying. It feels like something that exists on its own. This shift is quiet. You might not notice it immediately, but suddenly, the memory does not feel attached to you in the same way. It is present, but it is not leaning on you. It is there, but you are not supporting it. This is what happens when ownership fades. Ownership is not about responsibility. It is about proximity. When you own a memory, it feels close. Too close. Close enough to press against identity. Close enough to demand response. At night, memory drifts just far enough away that it no longer requires you to hold it in place. It begins to hold itself. This does not mean the memory is weak. It means it no longer needs your energy. During the day, memory borrows your strength. It uses your alertness to stay vivid, your vigilance to stay relevant, your resistance to stay sharp. At night, that strength is unavailable. So memory must stand on its own. And standing on its own, it becomes quieter, not smaller, just less demanding. This is why nighttime memories often feel oddly self-contained. They do not reach for you. They do not ask for interpretation. They do not ask to be placed inside a story. They simply exist. This self-contained quality changes the entire relationship. You are no longer responsible for the memory. You are no longer tasked with keeping it alive or keeping it away. Responsibility dissolves, and with it, pressure. Pressure is what made memory feel heavy. At night, pressure lifts. Not because the past has been forgiven, not because it has been resolved, but because it is no longer being held. This is what people often mistake for closure. But closure implies finality. What is happening here is release of ownership. The memory still exists. It just no longer belongs to you in the same way. Belonging is what creates obligation. Obligation is exhausting. Fatigue dissolves obligation. This is why tiredness often feels like freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from responsibility for it. You are no longer tasked with managing how the memory feels. You are no longer tasked with protecting yourself from it. You are no longer tasked with turning it into something useful. It does not need to teach you anything tonight. It does not need to warn you. It does not need to define you. It simply exists. Existence without demand is peaceful, not joyful. Peaceful. You might notice that when ownership fades, memory becomes strangely impersonal, not cold, just neutral, as if it could belong to anyone, as if it is no longer exclusively yours. This impersonal quality is not detachment. Detachment implies pushing away. What happens here is letting go of grip. Grip is what made the memory personal. Without grip, the memory does not press against the self. It floats nearby, close enough to be seen, far enough not to hurt. This distance is small, but it is everything. Pain lives in closeness. A little distance changes everything. This distance is not created by avoidance. It is created by fatigue. Fatigue makes holding impossible. So the system releases. This release allows the memory to reorganize itself, not into a solution, but into something stable. A stable memory does not need constant reinforcement. It does not need rehearsal. It does not need defense. It sits quietly in awareness. This stability feels like calm, but it is not calm achieved by effort. It is calm achieved by surrender. Not surrender as a moral act, surrender as a physical necessity. The body can no longer hold, so it lets go. And in letting go, it discovers that the memory does not collapse. It remains, but it remains without pressure. This discovery can be surprising. You might have believed that if you ever stopped holding the memory, it would overwhelm you, that it would flood the system, that it would take over. But instead, when you let go, the opposite happens. The memory settles. It does not rush forward. It does not expand. It stays where it is. This teaches something quietly important. That much of what you feared about memory was tied to the effort of holding it. When you stop holding, the memory does not attack. It rests. This rest is what allows the body to relax. Muscles loosen. Breathing deepens. The nervous system reads the situation as safe. Nothing is being fought. Nothing is being suppressed. Nothing is being carried. This is why sleep becomes possible. Sleep cannot happen when the system is burdened. Burden is weight. Fatigue removes weight by removing ownership. At night, you are no longer the custodian of your past. You are simply present with it. This presence without ownership is gentle, not because it is kind, but because it does not involve effort. Effort is what made the memory feel heavy. Without effort, weight disappears. The memory is still there, but it is no longer something you must do something with. You might notice now that the memory feels less urgent. It does not feel like something that requires attention. It does not feel like something that must be resolved before you can rest. It is simply there, and you are allowed to rest anyway. This allowance is rare during the day. During the day, rest is conditional. You rest when tasks are done, when problems are solved, when memory has been handled. At night, rest is unconditional. You rest because the system cannot continue. And in that unconditional rest, memory loses its leverage. Leverage comes from dependency. Memory depends on your energy to stay active. When energy is gone, memory becomes passive. Passive things do not demand. They can be noticed without being engaged. This is why nighttime awareness often feels spacious, not because thoughts are absent, but because they are no longer crowding you. They are no longer pressing in. They have their own space. and you have yours. This separation is not a boundary you create. It is a boundary that appears. When effort dissolves, effort collapses identity into memory. Without effort, identity expands. Expanded identity is less threatened by any single memory. Threat requires focus. Fatigue. Diffuse. Focus. Diffused focus reduces threat. This is why nighttime sadness can feel wide and calm. It fills space gently. It does not concentrate. Concentration hurts. Diffusion soothes. As you lie here, you may notice that the memory feels less like a possession and more like a landscape. Landscapes are not owned. They are visited. You can be in them without carrying them. You can leave them without conflict. This metaphor matters. When memory becomes a landscape, you are no longer trapped inside it. You are moving through it. Movement without urgency is peaceful. There is no rush, no direction, just presence. This presence is enough. You do not need to extract meaning. You do not need to draw conclusions. Those are daytime activities. At night, the system does not have the energy for meaning making, so meaning loosens. And when meaning loosens, pain loses its sharpest edge. Because pain is sharpest when it insists on something, when it insists on being understood, when it insists on being fixed. At night, pain does not insist. It waits. Waiting things do not hurt as much. They are patient. They do not push. This patience is not intentional. It is the result of lowered energy. Lowered energy slows everything. Slowed systems are gentle systems. Gentleness here is not kindness. It is physics. Less force, less pressure, less friction. This is why nighttime feels forgiving. Not because you forgive, but because nothing is being forced. As this state deepens, you may notice a quiet trust forming. Not trust in the past, not trust in the memory, trust in the present. A sense that nothing needs to be done right now. That you are allowed to stop holding. That the memory will not collapse the system if you let go. This trust is fragile. It exists only while fatigue holds the system in this configuration. Morning will change it. But for now, it is real. And it is enough. You might notice now that the memory is no longer central. It has moved to the periphery. Not because it has been pushed there, but because you have stopped standing under it. This shift is subtle, but it is everything. When memory is no longer above you, it cannot weigh on you. It can exist without burden. This is what allows the final transition to begin. Because once memory is no longer held, and no longer guarded, and no longer reconstructed, and no longer resisted, it does something unexpected. It begins to fade into the background of awareness. Not disappear, just become quieter, less distinct, less demanding. This quieting is not loss. It is integration. Integration does not announce itself. It simply happens when nothing is being fought. As you rest here, notice how the memory now feels. Notice how it no longer asks for ownership. Notice how it no longer demands effort. Notice how it holds itself. And notice how, in this state, you are finally free to do nothing. Nothing at all. This is not the end of the story. But it is the moment when the story stops asking you to carry it. And that is enough. To let the night continue its work. There is no moment when memory leaves. It does not stand up, gather itself, and walk out. What happens instead is quieter. Memory stops announcing itself. It remains, but it no longer occupies the center of attention. This is not disappearance. It is recession. Like a sound that does not end, but fades until you are no longer sure when you stopped listening. During the day, memory stands in the foreground. It speaks loudly enough to interrupt thought. It insists on relevance. It competes with the present. At night, something shifts. Not because the memory is resolved, But because the present grows heavier, your body sinks. Your breathing deepens. Your awareness narrows. The present becomes thick. And in a thick present, memory loses contrast. Contrast is what makes memory vivid. Without contrast, memory blends. It becomes part of the background texture of awareness. Still there, still real, just not sharp. This blending is what many people mistake for forgetting. But forgetting removes access. What is happening here is different. Access remains. Urgency disappears. Urgency is what gave memory its voice. Without urgency, memory does not call. It waits. Waiting memories feel gentle, not because they are kind, but because they are patient. Patience comes from stillness. Stillness comes from fatigue. Fatigue does not erase the past. It surrounds it. It wraps memory in a larger field of sensation. The weight of the body, the rhythm of breath, the darkness behind closed eyes. These sensations become louder than thought. And when sensation dominates, memory quiets. Not by force, by proportion. Memory becomes one thing among many, instead of everything. This redistribution matters. Pain dominates when it stands alone. It softens when it is contextualized. At night, context returns. The body returns. The present returns. And memory takes its place within that. You may notice that as you lie here, it becomes harder to isolate the memory, not because it is gone, but because it no longer separates itself from the rest of experience. It does not rise above the body. It sits within it. This containment is gentle. Containment does not require control. It requires presence. At night, presence is passive. You are not actively attending. You are simply here. And being here is enough to hold what happened without strain. This is not integration in the therapeutic sense. Integration implies work. What happens at night requires none. The brain does not organize. It does not categorize. It does not synthesize meaning. It simply stops isolating. Isolation is what made memory loud. When memory was isolated, it felt urgent. When it is no longer isolated, it feels ordinary. Ordinary does not mean unimportant. It means unexceptional. It no longer demands special treatment. This ordinariness is calming. You might notice that the memory now feels similar to many other things you have experienced. Not unique in its power, not singled out, just one moment in a long sequence. This sequence does not need to be reviewed. It does not need to be understood. It does not need to be justified. It simply exists. Existence without commentary is quiet. Quiet allows rest. Rest does not ask questions. Questions keep the mind active. At night, questions lose momentum. They appear half-formed, then dissolve. They do not insist on answers. Without answers, the mind relaxes. This relaxation is not ignorance. It is trust in the system. The system knows how to power down. It has done this before. Every night, it performs the same movement, lowering, softening, letting go of precision. Precision is expensive. Accuracy is expensive. Meaning is expensive. At night, the brain chooses what is cheap. Sensation, presence, stillness. Memory cannot compete with these. It fades, not because it is weak, but because the environment has changed. In this environment, memory does not need to perform. It does not need to remind. It does not need to protect. It can simply be. And being, without doing, is restful. You might notice now that even the idea of memory feels distant. Not the memory itself, but the concept of it. The mind stops labeling, stops naming, stops distinguishing between thought and sensation. Everything becomes less defined. This loss of definition is not confusion. It is softness. Sharp boundaries hurt. Soft boundaries absorb. At night, boundaries soften everywhere. Between thoughts, between feelings, between past and present. This softening allows experience to merge. When things merge, there is nothing to collide. Collision is what creates pain. Without collision, experience flows. Flow is quiet. Flow does not resist. Flow does not demand. It moves. Movement without direction is soothing. Direction requires intention. Intention requires energy. Fatigue removes energy, so direction disappears. You are no longer going anywhere. Memory is no longer going anywhere. Everything simply drifts. Drift is gentle. Drift does not hurry. Drift does not insist. It carries what it carries, without effort. This is why nighttime awareness often feels like floating. Not because you are elevated, but because gravity has changed. The pull of urgency weakens. The pull of meaning weakens. What remains is weight. The honest weight of the body. The slow pull of sleep. These forces are stronger than memory. They draw attention inward. Inward toward sensation. Inward toward rest. Memory follows. Not because it chooses to, but because nothing else is holding it in place. When nothing holds memory at the front, it settles. Settled things are quiet. This quiet is not silence. It is absence of demand. No one is asking anything of you. Not the memory, not the past, not the future. Even the present stops asking. This is the state sleep requires. Sleep does not come to a mind that is negotiating. It comes to a mind that has stopped negotiating. Negotiation requires energy. At night, energy is gone. So negotiation ends. Memory no longer bargains. It no longer says, "Look at me." It no longer says, "Fix this." It no longer says, "Remember." It simply exists in the same way. The body exists without argument, without explanation. This equality between memory and body is what allows rest. When memory is no longer above the body can relax. And when the body relaxes, sleep approaches naturally. Sleep does not erase memory. It does something else. It removes the conditions that made memory loud. Those conditions will return. Morning will bring energy. Energy will bring sharpness. Sharpness may bring pain. This does not negate what is happening now. This moment is not a solution. It is a state that shows something important. That pain is not fixed in the past. It is generated in the present. And the present, when allowed to soften, changes everything. You do not need to remember this. You do not need to apply it. You do not need to use it later. Using requires effort. Effort will come back on its own. For now, nothing is required. Memory does not need you. You do not need memory. Both can exist without interacting. This mutual independence is rare, but it is real, and it is enough. You may notice now that the memory you began with feels far away, not removed, just quiet. Like a room in a house you are no longer standing in. You know it exists. You could go there, but there is no reason to. Where you are now is sufficient. Sufficiency is rest. Rest is the only task of the night. The night does not demand understanding. It does not demand forgiveness. It does not demand closure. It demands nothing. And in demanding nothing, it gives you something rare. A space where the past can exist without touching you. A space where the body can sink without being interrupted. A space where the mind can loosen without fear. This space is not permanent, but it does not need to be. It only needs to last long enough for the system to power down. That is happening now, not because you chose it, not because you did anything right, but because fatigue has done what effort never could. It has removed the need to hold. the need to guard, the need to fix. What remains is stillness. Stillness does not explain. It does not justify. It does not conclude. It simply is. And being is enough to let the night continue. Nothing more needs to happen. Nothing needs to be answered. The memory can stay where it is. You can stay where you are. Everything is allowed to drift into whatever comes next.